Anchoring bias happens when people rely too much on the first piece of information they receive. This first piece of information becomes a reference point or anchor and influences all the decisions that follow. People don't always realize they are doing this, and it can lead to poor judgment. Imagine someone walks into a store looking for a new phone. The first phone they see costs $1,200. Every other phone they look at afterward seems cheap in comparison. Even if another phone is $800, which is still expensive, I'd love to invite you to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's incredible to think about how we're all connected through these stories and ideas. If you enjoy these thought-provoking explorations, consider subscribing to Tired Thinker so we can keep bringing you reflective narratives. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let your imagination drift as we delve into the mind-boggling paradoxes and mysteries. It feels like a good deal because of that first price. The person might end up spending more than they originally planned because their mind keeps comparing every phone to that first one. Anchoring can affect negotiations too. A seller might set the price of a car at $20,000, even though they are willing to sell it for $15,000. The buyer sees that high price first and starts negotiating down from there. Even if they manage to get the price lowered to $16,000, they still feel like they got a deal. The reality is that they may have overpaid because the seller set a high anchor. This bias is not just about numbers. It can influence opinions and decisions in many ways. In job interviews, the first impression a candidate makes can become an anchor for the employer. If the interviewer sees that the candidate is nervous at the beginning, they might assume the person lacks confidence. Even if the candidate improves later, the first impression lingers. On the other hand, if the candidate starts strong, the interviewer may overlook small mistakes later on. Marketing professionals use anchoring all the time. A product might be labeled as originally $100, now only $50. The original price acts as the anchor, making the discount look bigger than it really is. The buyer doesn't stop to ask whether the product was ever worth $100 in the first place. Restaurants use anchoring by putting an expensive item at the top of the menu. Even if no one buys it, it makes everything else seem reasonable. A $40 steak looks expensive until it sits next to a $90 seafood platter. Anchoring also affects personal finance. When people start investing, the first stock price they see influences their expectations. If they buy a stock at $50, they might refuse to sell it for less, even if all signs point to a further drop. They keep comparing the current price to the $50 anchor and hold on longer than they should. This same thinking happens in real estate. If a person buys a house for $400,000 and later needs to sell it, they might refuse to accept $380,000, even if the market has dropped. They feel like they are losing money because they are stuck on that original price, even if selling at $380,000 is the best option. Legal decisions also show how anchoring works. If a prosecutor suggests a long prison sentence, the judge might unconsciously adjust their ruling based on that number. Research shows that when judges hear a high sentence suggestion first, they give longer sentences, even when the crime is the same. Even experienced professionals fall into this trap. Medical decisions are not immune either. A doctor who first diagnoses a patient with one illness might stick to that diagnosis, even when new symptoms suggest something else. They anchored themselves to their first impression, making it harder to change course. This can delay proper treatment. In everyday life, anchoring influences how people judge others. If someone is introduced as brilliant, people will look for signs that support that idea. If they are introduced as difficult, people may interpret neutral behavior in a negative way. The first description acts as an anchor, shaping perceptions going forward. This bias appears in sports as well. If a team starts the season with a few losses, fans might assume they are bad, even if they improve later. Those early losses set an anchor, making it harder to see later wins as a sign of real progress. Even social issues and politics are influenced by anchoring. If a politician makes a strong statement early in a debate, it can frame the entire conversation. People might judge every argument afterward based on that first statement, even if it wasn't the most logical one. One way to reduce the effect of anchoring is to seek out multiple points of reference before making a decision. Instead of accepting the first price as normal, people can compare multiple options. In negotiations, starting with an independent estimate can help counter the effect of an initial offer. In personal decisions, reminding oneself that first impressions are not always correct can help avoid snap judgments. Understanding how anchoring works can help people recognize when it is influencing their choices. Whether shopping, negotiating, making investments, or forming opinions, being aware of this bias allows for more rational decision-making. Recognizing the power of that first piece of information is the first step in reducing its hold. The availability heuristic makes people rely too much on the information that comes to mind quickly. When something is easy to remember, people assume it must be more common, important, or true. This happens because the brain takes shortcuts to make decisions fast. Instead of carefully analyzing all possible information, it grabs whatever is easiest to recall and uses that to make a judgment. This mental shortcut helps in many situations, but also leads to errors in thinking. Imagine someone who just watched the news and saw multiple stories about shark attacks. If you ask them whether sharks or falling coconuts kill more people each year, they will probably say sharks. Shark attacks make the news often because they are dramatic and frightening. Falling coconuts don't make headlines because they seem ordinary. But in reality, falling coconuts kill more people than sharks do each year. The person's brain latches onto the vivid, memorable information from the news rather than looking at the actual numbers. The result is a mistaken belief about how dangerous sharks are. This happens with crime as well. If a person watches a lot of news about violent crimes, they may believe crime is rising, even if statistics show that crime rates are falling. The more they see crime stories, the easier it is to recall those events. When asked if their city is safe, they may immediately think of a recent shooting or robbery they heard about. That single memory will feel more important than broader statistics, making them believe crime is worse than it actually is. Marketing and advertising often take advantage of the availability heuristic. If a company runs many ads about how its product solves a common problem, people may assume the problem is worse than it really is. Consider an ad campaign for a new home security system. The commercials show multiple break-ins and emphasize how often burglaries happen. Someone who watches these ads over and over may start to believe break-ins are a daily threat, even if crime data shows that break-ins are rare in their area. Since the images and messages are fresh in their mind, they think crime is more common than it is. This makes them more likely to buy the security system. Medical concerns also trigger this bias. If someone hears a lot about a rare disease, they may start to worry that they or someone they know will get it. Suppose a celebrity is diagnosed with a rare illness and the media covers it extensively. Many people will learn about the disease and begin to fear it. Even though it is statistically unlikely that they will get it, they may overestimate the risk simply because they keep hearing about it. Meanwhile, they might ignore more common health risks, such as high blood pressure or obesity, because those don't make the news as often. Personal experiences play a big role too. If a person knows someone who got into a car accident while driving at night, they might think nighttime driving is especially dangerous. The accident sticks in their mind because they have a direct connection to it. They may refuse to drive at night, even if statistics show that driving during rush hour is riskier. The memory of that one event feels stronger than objective data. Politics is full of examples of the availability heuristic in action. Suppose a politician repeats the same claim many times, such as, "The economy is collapsing." If people keep hearing this, they might start to believe it, even if economic indicators say otherwise. They don't analyze economic reports or look at broad trends. Instead, they recall the claim they have heard over and over. This makes the claim seem more true than it is. The same happens with stereotypes. If someone meets a few people from a certain group who behave a certain way, they might assume everyone from that group is like that. Instead of considering all the people who don't fit that stereotype, they focus on the few examples they can easily remember. The availability heuristic affects decisions about risk and safety. If a plane crashes and gets a lot of media coverage, people may feel nervous about flying. Even though flying is one of the safest ways to travel, the crash is so memorable that it makes air travel seem much riskier than it is. Meanwhile, people feel safe driving, even though car accidents are far more common. Because car crashes happen every day and don't make big headlines, they don't seem as shocking or memorable. This makes flying seem more dangerous than driving, even though the opposite is true. This bias can also affect financial decisions. If someone invests in the stock market and sees a news story about a major crash, they might panic and sell their stocks. The crash stands out in their mind more than the many times the market has recovered. They might ignore the fact that markets tend to go up over time and instead focus only on the recent drop. Because the crash is easy to recall, they overestimate the likelihood of losing money, even though holding on to investments for the long term is usually a better strategy. Even in relationships, this bias can show up. If someone has a bad argument with a friend, they might suddenly think the friendship is in trouble. The argument is fresh in their mind, making it seem more significant than all the good times they've had. Instead of looking at the bigger picture, they focus on the most recent negative experience. This can lead to unnecessary worries, or even ending a friendship over a single bad moment. The availability heuristic also plays a role in decision-making at work. If a manager recalls a time when an employee made a mistake, they might assume that person is unreliable. They may forget about all the times the employee performed well and instead focus on the one mistake that stands out. This could lead to unfair evaluations or missed opportunities for that employee. On a larger scale, businesses might make poor decisions because they focus too much on recent failures rather than long-term success trends. Education is another area where this bias has an impact. If a student does poorly on a test, they might believe they are bad at that subject. They focus on that one failure instead of considering all the times they understood the material. This might make them avoid the subject in the future, limiting their opportunities. Teachers, too, might misjudge students if they only recall a student's worst performance instead of looking at their overall progress. The availability heuristic can also shape how people view technology. If someone reads about a few cases where artificial intelligence made mistakes, they might assume AI is unreliable. They focus on those errors rather than on the many ways AI is used successfully. This might make them hesitant to use AI-driven tools, even when those tools could be helpful. On the other hand, if they only hear success stories, they might overestimate AI's capabilities and trust it too much. The same bias affects how people think about social issues. Suppose there is a heated debate about immigration, and someone sees many news stories about crimes committed by immigrants. They might assume immigration leads to more crime, even if data shows that immigrants commit crimes at lower rates than native-born citizens. Because crime stories are shocking and memorable, they shape the person's view more than statistics do. The availability heuristic is powerful because it shapes beliefs and decisions without people realizing it. When information is vivid, emotional, or frequently repeated, it feels more important than it actually is. People make judgments based on what is easiest to remember rather than what is most accurate. This can lead to errors in thinking, poor decisions, and unnecessary fears. Recognizing this bias can help people question their assumptions and look at the bigger picture before making decisions. People rely on mental shortcuts when making decisions, and one of the most common is the availability heuristic. This happens when someone judges how likely something is based on how easily they can remember examples. If something comes to mind quickly, they assume it happens often or is more significant than it really is. Imagine a person who watches a lot of news about plane crashes. Every time a plane crashes, it becomes a major story. The images of wreckage, grieving families, and dramatic rescues fill the screen. Because these stories are shocking, they stick in memory. Later, if someone asks this person whether flying is safe, they might say no. They might believe plane crashes are common, even though the actual odds of dying in a plane crash are extremely low. Statistically, flying is much safer than driving, but car accidents don't make the news in the same dramatic way. Since car crashes happen all the time, they don't seem as shocking, and individual crashes don't stand out. The person overestimates the danger of flying because plane crashes are easier to recall than car accidents. This bias affects people in many areas of life. It influences how they think about crime, health risks, and even their own skills. If a neighborhood experiences one highly publicized crime, residents might assume crime rates are rising, even if statistics show crime is going down. They might feel unsafe walking outside, even though the real risk hasn't changed. Their perception is shaped by the ease with which they remember the recent crime. The availability heuristic also affects how people think about health. Someone who knows a person who had a bad reaction to a vaccine might assume vaccines are dangerous. They might ignore the millions of people who get vaccinated without any problems because those cases don't stand out. The one extreme case they remember influences their entire view. They fail to consider the broader evidence. Marketing and media take advantage of this bias all the time. Advertisers use memorable slogans and dramatic visuals to make products seem more effective. A cleaning product commercial might show a side-by-side comparison of a dirty surface and a sparkling clean one. The contrast is dramatic, and the viewer remembers it. Later, when they shop for cleaning supplies, they recall the commercial and assume that brand works best, even if they haven't compared it to other products. Politicians and advocacy groups use the same strategy. They highlight extreme cases to make a point, knowing that people will remember those cases more than the actual statistics. A single story about a struggling family can shape public opinion more than a detailed economic report. People respond to stories they can picture in their minds. They don't naturally think in numbers and probabilities. The availability heuristic also affects personal decision-making. Suppose someone starts a new diet and loses 5 pounds in the first week. They remember that success and assume the diet is highly effective. They might ignore long-term studies showing the weight loss is temporary or unsustainable. Their personal experience is more vivid than scientific data, so it carries more weight in their judgment. Investors fall into the same trap. If a friend makes money by investing in a trendy stock, they might assume that stock is a great investment. They recall their friend's success easily, but they don't think about all the people who lost money on similar stocks. The ease of recalling one success story makes them overestimate their own chances of making money. The availability heuristic influences memory in a way that makes rare events seem common and common events seem rare. It makes people trust personal experiences more than broad evidence. It shapes fears, choices, and beliefs in ways that aren't always logical. Once people become aware of this bias, they can start to question their assumptions. They can ask themselves whether they are basing their beliefs on real data or just on what comes to mind first. People often believe they understand more than they actually do. The Dunning-Kruger Effect describes a cognitive bias where people with low ability in a particular area overestimate their competence. This happens because they lack the knowledge to see their own mistakes. When someone is inexperienced, they do not yet know what they do not know. Their limited understanding makes them feel confident in their abilities, even when they make errors. Imagine a new driver who has just learned to operate a car. They understand how to accelerate, brake, and steer. They assume they are just as skilled as someone with years of experience. They might speed through turns or follow too closely, not realizing how much skill is needed to anticipate dangers. Their confidence is high, but their actual ability is low. As they gain experience, they start to see their own mistakes. They notice how professionals drive with smooth control and better awareness. Over time, their confidence drops as they realize driving requires more skill than they initially thought. This effect happens in many areas of life. A person who just started investing in the stock market might believe they can pick winning stocks without research. They have seen news stories about people making money quickly, so they assume it is easy. Without understanding market trends, economic cycles, or risk management, they dive in with confidence. When the market shifts, they lose money and feel surprised. Their early confidence came from a lack of understanding about how complex investing can be. The same pattern appears in the workplace. A new employee might assume they know how to handle any task given to them. They think their work is just as good as their experienced colleagues. But after receiving feedback, they realize their work lacks depth. As they gain experience, they see how much more there is to learn. In contrast, seasoned professionals often feel less confident because they understand the complexities of their field. In education, students often experience this bias. A student who has just started studying a subject might feel they grasp the material quickly. They might even believe they understand it better than their peers. Then they take a difficult test and struggle. They realize their understanding was surface level. As they continue studying, they recognize the depth of the subject. Their confidence decreases before it improves again with real expertise. Social situations also reveal this effect. Someone who has just learned a little about psychology might believe they can analyze people with ease. They might assume they can tell when someone is lying or understand others' motivations without much effort. But professional psychologists spend years refining these skills. What looks obvious to an amateur is usually much more complex. One major cause of the Dunning-Kruger effect is the difference between knowledge and metacognition. Metacognition refers to the ability to think about one's own thinking. People with strong metacognition can evaluate their own knowledge and recognize gaps in their understanding. Those with low metacognition struggle to assess their own abilities accurately. Because they do not know what they do not know, they assume they are more skilled than they are. Technology makes this bias more visible. With the internet, anyone can look up information quickly. Someone who has read a few articles about nutrition might believe they understand diet science as well as a trained nutritionist. They might give advice confidently, unaware of the research and experience required to understand how different diets affect people. This happens in medical discussions, politics, and even legal matters. A little knowledge makes people feel like experts, even when they are far from it. Sports provide another example. A beginner golfer might assume they have mastered the game after a few successful swings. They might feel confident that they can match experienced players. But real skill in golf comes from years of practice, understanding angles, wind resistance, and mental focus. As the golfer plays more, they see how much they still need to learn. The more they practice, the less confident they become, until their skill level finally catches up with their experience. The Dunning-Kruger effect also influences leadership. A new manager might believe they know exactly how to motivate a team. They might assume that leadership is just about giving orders. But as they deal with real workplace challenges, they realize managing people requires emotional intelligence, conflict resolution, and strategic thinking. At first, they were overconfident because they did not know how complex leadership can be. Some people mistake confidence for competence. This is why individuals with less knowledge sometimes appear more persuasive. They speak with certainty because they do not see their own gaps. This can make them seem like experts to others who are also uninformed. In contrast, true experts often speak with caution because they understand the complexity of their subject. Avoiding the Dunning-Kruger effect requires self-awareness and humility. People who assume they are always right are often the ones who need to question themselves the most. A willingness to learn and accept mistakes helps reduce this bias. Seeking feedback from others can also provide a clearer picture of one's own abilities. Growth happens when people move past their initial overconfidence and start seeing their own limits. This process can feel uncomfortable. It is hard to admit that one's early confidence was misplaced, but this awareness is the first step toward real improvement. As people develop true expertise, their confidence stabilizes, no longer based on illusion, but on real knowledge. This effect does not mean everyone is bad at judging their own abilities. Some people naturally reflect on their strengths and weaknesses, but those who do not take the time to question themselves are more likely to fall into the trap of overconfidence. Learning, questioning, and staying open to feedback are key to overcoming this cognitive bias. The hindsight bias makes people believe they knew it all along. After an event happens, they see it as more predictable than it really was. This bias distorts memory and influences decision-making. people think past outcomes were obvious, even when they had no way of knowing. This can lead to overconfidence and poor judgments in the future. Imagine someone watching a football game. Before the game starts, they feel unsure about which team will win. But after the game ends, they insist they knew the winning team would come out on top. They forget their earlier uncertainty. Their brain reshapes the memory, making the victory seem inevitable. This happens because once we know the outcome, our mind rewrites the past. Court cases provide another example. Jurors, after hearing the verdict, believe the outcome was always clear. They assume the guilty party was obvious from the start, even though during the trial the evidence was complex and uncertain. Lawyers understand this bias and use it to shape arguments. They highlight key details that, in hindsight, make the verdict appear obvious. Investors fall into this trap too. After a stock market crash, they claim it was easy to see it coming. They forget the uncertainty before the drop. If someone had told them beforehand to sell their stocks, they might have ignored the advice. But after the crash, they convinced themselves the warning signs were everywhere. This overconfidence leads them to make risky decisions in the future, believing they can predict market trends. Hindsight bias appears in history, making past events seem like they had only one possible outcome. When reading about major wars, people think they were inevitable, but before the conflict started, many different paths could have been taken. Leaders faced complex choices with uncertain results. However, history books often present events as if they were destined to happen. This simplifies the past, removing the confusion and unpredictability that real-life decision-makers faced. Students studying for exams also experience this bias. Before taking a test, they feel unsure about certain topics. But after seeing the correct answers, they believe they knew them all along. This false sense of confidence can hurt future studying. Instead of improving weak areas, they assume they already understand the material. As a result, they don't prepare as thoroughly as they should. Doctors and medical professionals encounter hindsight bias when diagnosing patients. If a patient's condition worsens, doctors might believe the warning signs were obvious. They forget how uncertain the diagnosis was at the time. This bias can lead to unfair blame. A doctor who made a reasonable decision with limited information might be judged harshly after the outcome is known. The same happens in politics. After an election, people claim they always knew who would win. Polls, debates, and campaign strategies seem to point in one clear direction, after the fact. But before the votes were counted, the outcome felt uncertain. Hindsight bias makes political analysts seem more accurate than they really were. They rewrite their past opinions to match the final results. This bias affects personal relationships too. When a couple breaks up, outsiders often say they saw it coming. They believe the relationship had obvious problems, but if asked before the breakup, they might not have predicted it. Looking back, they highlight the negative moments and ignore the good times. This reshaping of memory makes events seem more predictable than they actually were. In business, leaders and employees often think past failures were more obvious than they were. After a project fails, people claim they knew it wouldn't work, but during the project, they might have felt hopeful. This thinking creates unfair blame. Instead of learning from mistakes, people focus on pointing fingers. It also discourages innovation. Employees hesitate to take risks because they fear being judged after the fact. Hindsight bias leads to overconfidence in many areas. People believe they can predict future events better than they actually can. This can be dangerous in fields like finance, medicine, and law. When people think they knew it all along, they stop questioning their assumptions. They rely on flawed memory instead of careful analysis. One reason hindsight bias happens is that our brains like to simplify the past. Humans prefer clear narratives over uncertainty. Once we know an outcome, we mentally rearrange events to make them fit a logical story. This gives us a sense of control. If events were always predictable, then the world seems less random and chaotic. Memory also plays a role. People don't remember their past thoughts accurately. Instead of recalling the full range of possibilities they once considered, they focus on the outcome that actually happened. The brain discards the options that didn't come true. This selective memory strengthens hindsight bias. Social pressure contributes as well. Nobody likes admitting they were wrong. Saying, "I knew it all along," makes people seem more knowledgeable. It helps them maintain their self-image. They don't have to confront the fact that they were uncertain or mistaken. Understanding hindsight bias can help people make better decisions. Recognizing that past events weren't as predictable as they seem encourages humility. It reminds people to question their assumptions instead of assuming they will always predict outcomes correctly. One way to counter hindsight bias is to write down predictions before events happen. Keeping a journal of forecasts helps track how often people are actually right. Reviewing these records can reveal how much uncertainty existed at the time. This practice reduces overconfidence and encourages more careful thinking. Another method is to consider alternative possibilities. When looking at past events, it helps to ask, what else could have happened? Listing other possible outcomes reminds people that history wasn't inevitable. It also improves decision-making by keeping an open mind about the future. Encouraging honest discussions can also reduce hindsight bias. In workplaces, leaders can create environments where employees feel safe admitting uncertainty. Instead of punishing mistakes, organizations can focus on learning from them. This approach fosters better problem-solving and innovation. Hindsight bias is powerful, but recognizing it can help people avoid its traps. By questioning memories and considering different perspectives, individuals can make more informed decisions. Instead of assuming the past was obvious, they can acknowledge the complexity and unpredictability of life. The self-serving bias makes people take credit for their successes while blaming external factors for their failures. When something goes right, they believe it's because of their skills, intelligence, or effort. When something goes wrong, they blame luck, other people, or circumstances beyond their control. This bias helps protect self-esteem, but it can also distort reality and prevent personal growth. Imagine a student who gets an A on a test. She tells herself it's because she studied hard and is naturally smart. The next time she takes a test, she gets a D. Instead of admitting she didn't prepare enough, she blames the teacher for making the test too hard or claims the questions were unfair. She sees success as her own doing, but shifts responsibility when she fails. This pattern helps her feel good about herself, but it also keeps her from improving. Athletes often display this bias. A football player scores the winning goal and thinks it's because of his skill and training. The next game, he misses an important shot. Instead of reflecting on what he could have done better, he says the referee made a bad call or the field conditions were poor. If he always blames external factors, he won't see areas where he can improve. People in the workplace also show self-serving bias. A salesperson closes a big deal and believes it's because of his charm and talent. If he loses a deal, he says the customer was difficult or the economy is bad. A manager takes credit for a team's success, but blames the team when things go wrong. This kind of thinking can lead to a toxic work environment where no one takes responsibility for mistakes. Drivers on the road often assume they are better than others. If someone cuts them off, they think that person is reckless. But if they make the same mistake, they say, "I had no choice. Traffic was crazy." They judge others harshly but excuse themselves. In relationships, self-serving bias can cause conflict. A person in an argument might think, "I was just being honest, but he overreacted." If the roles were reversed, the same person might say, "She was rude for no reason." By always seeing oneself as the reasonable one, misunderstandings grow. This bias appears in sports fans too. When their favorite team wins, they say, "We played great." When their team loses, they blame the referees, the weather, or injuries. They don't acknowledge that the other team may have simply played better. Even in politics, self-serving bias is common. When a political party wins an election, they say it's because of their great ideas and hard work. If they lose, they blame the media, the system, or the ignorance of voters. They rarely admit their campaign had weaknesses. Students, professionals, drivers, sports fans, and politicians all fall into this pattern because it's easier than facing flaws. Acknowledging mistakes requires humility and self-awareness. People don't like feeling incompetent, so they shape reality in their favor. In everyday life, people also apply this bias to their health. A person who eats well and exercises might believe they are responsible for staying healthy. If they get sick, they say it's because of germs at work or bad weather. They don't consider that they might have ignored early symptoms or didn't get enough rest. This bias can be seen in parenting. If a child behaves well, parents think it's because of their great parenting. If the child misbehaves, they blame bad influences or the school. Parents rarely consider that their discipline methods might need adjusting. This bias even affects social media. A person who gets many likes on a post believes it's because they are interesting or funny. If they get few likes, they blame the algorithm or assume people didn't see it. They don't consider that the post may not have been engaging. The self-serving bias is deeply ingrained. It helps protect self-esteem and maintain confidence. However, it also prevents self-improvement. If a person never accepts responsibility for failure, they don't learn from mistakes. They miss chances to grow. Breaking this bias takes effort. People need to pause and reflect on their role in both success and failure. Instead of immediately blaming external factors, they can ask, what could I have done differently? This small shift in thinking can lead to growth. People dislike losing more than they enjoy winning. If someone loses $20, they feel more pain than the happiness they would feel if they found $20. This reaction happens even when the amount is the same. The fear of loss influences choices in many areas of life, from investing to relationships to everyday decisions. It explains why people avoid risks, even when taking a chance could lead to better outcomes. A person might hesitate before selling an item for less than they paid. If someone buys a watch for $300, they might refuse to sell it for $250, even if they no longer use it. They focus on the $50 loss rather than the fact that they would be better off without an unused watch. The same feeling applies to stocks. An investor holds on to a losing stock, hoping it will rise again, because selling at a lower price makes the loss real. If they let go of the idea that the original price matters, they might make better decisions. Loss aversion influences how businesses set prices. Companies design sales and discounts to make people feel they are avoiding loss. If a store raises the price of a product but offers a limited time discount, customers rush to buy it before the deal disappears. The item may have cost the same before the price increase, but now the potential loss of a discount makes it more tempting. Supermarkets use buy one, get one free deals to tap into this bias. Even when people do not need two of the same product, they buy both to avoid missing the free item. The idea of a lost opportunity outweighs the need for the product. People also feel loss in decision-making. If someone spends years in a job they dislike, they might stay because quitting feels like throwing away time. The years spent there act as an anchor, making them feel they have invested too much to walk away. Even if a new job offers better pay and satisfaction, they hesitate. The same pattern appears in relationships. A person may remain in an unhappy relationship because they have been together for many years. Even when leaving would be the better choice, the idea of wasted time keeps them from moving on. Gamblers often experience loss aversion in real time. If someone loses $50 on a bet, they may keep betting to win it back. They no longer focus on making smart choices. Instead, they feel driven to erase the loss. Casinos structure their games to encourage this reaction. A person who wins early in a game feels excited, but when they start losing, they chase their losses. The more they lose, the stronger the urge to recover. This cycle keeps them playing longer than planned. Loss aversion also affects voting and policy decisions. People fear losing what they already have more than they hope to gain something new. Politicians use this to shape campaigns. If a candidate says they will introduce a new benefit, voters may not react strongly. But if they say their opponent will take away an existing benefit, people pay more attention. The fear of losing something they already have is more powerful than the promise of something new. This is why governments struggle to remove subsidies or tax breaks once they are in place. Even if removing them would be better in the long run, voters resist the change because they see it as a loss. In sports, loss aversion affects strategy. A football team leading in the final minutes may play more cautiously, trying to protect their lead instead of extending it. This cautious play sometimes backfires because the other team, with nothing to lose, plays aggressively and takes risks. A tennis player who is ahead might tighten up, fearing a mistake more than they focus on playing well. The fear of losing what they have built affects their performance. Loss aversion also explains why people hoard objects they do not need. If someone owns a closet full of old clothes, they may find it hard to throw them away, even if they never wear them. They imagine a future where they might need a particular shirt or jacket, even if that moment never comes. This is why people struggle with decluttering. Throwing something away feels like losing an item, even if they do not use it. The same feeling applies to digital clutter. Someone might keep thousands of unread emails or old computer files because deleting them feels like a loss. The bias plays a role in health decisions as well. A person who has spent years eating unhealthy foods might resist changing their diet, even if it would improve their health. They see giving up familiar foods as a loss rather than focusing on what they gain from a healthier lifestyle. Smokers experience this when trying to quit. They feel the loss of cigarettes more than the benefits of quitting, making it hard to break the habit. This is why many addiction treatments focus on reframing the change as a gain rather than a loss. Loss aversion affects negotiations and bargaining. If someone sells a car, they may reject an offer that is slightly lower than their asking price, even if it is fair. They feel the potential loss of a few $100s more than they appreciate the gain of selling the car. The same happens in salary negotiations. A job candidate may turn down an offer because it feels like a loss compared to their expected salary, even if the offer is reasonable. The fear of losing a small amount outweighs the benefits of securing the job. Marketing strategies take advantage of this bias. Free trials work because once people use a service, they do not want to lose access. If a streaming service offers a free month, many users continue to pay because canceling feels like giving up something they already have. The same logic applies to subscriptions and memberships. Companies give customers a taste of the benefits, knowing that the pain of losing access will drive them to continue paying. Loss aversion even affects how people set goals. If someone starts a fitness challenge and misses a day, they may feel they have failed completely. Instead of continuing, they give up because they feel they have already lost progress. The same happens with saving money. If someone sets a goal to save a certain amount each month but falls short, they may feel discouraged and stop saving altogether. They focus on the shortfall instead of the progress they have made. People also apply this bias when making social comparisons. If someone sees a friend achieve success, they might feel they are losing by comparison. Instead of feeling happy for their friend, they focus on what they do not have. Social media amplifies this effect. Seeing others travel, buy homes, or advance in their careers makes people feel like they are falling behind. They fear missing out or losing status, even if their own situation has not changed. The way people structure their daily routines also reflects loss aversion. A person might stick to a familiar route to work, even if a different route would be faster. They worry that changing their routine could lead to delays, so they keep doing what they know. The same pattern appears in habits. If someone watches the same television show every night, they may hesitate to try something new because they do not want to risk losing enjoyment. This bias is deeply rooted in human behavior. It shapes choices, sometimes for the worse. Understanding it can help people make better decisions. Instead of fearing loss, they can focus on what they gain by changing their perspective. The framing effect influences how people make decisions based on how information is presented, rather than the actual facts. It affects choices in many areas, including business, healthcare, politics, and everyday life. The same information, when framed differently, can lead to completely different decisions. Imagine a doctor explaining a surgery to a patient. If the doctor says, "This procedure has a 90% survival rate," the patient feels reassured and is more likely to agree to the surgery. But if the doctor says there's a 10% chance of death, the patient may hesitate or even refuse. The facts remain the same, but the framing changes how the patient perceives the risk. The effect plays out in everyday purchases as well. A grocery store may label beef as 80% lean rather than 20% fat because customers associate leanness with health. Even though both labels describe the same product, shoppers are more likely to choose the one that sounds healthier. In financial decisions, people are more likely to invest in a fund that has a 75% success rate rather than one with a 25% failure rate, even if the performance is identical. Marketing experts use this effect to influence consumer choices. A restaurant may describe a dish as premium grass-fed beef rather than regular beef, even if there's little difference. The way words shape perception affects how people feel about the product before they even try it. In politics, candidates frame their policies to make them more appealing. One may describe a tax as helping fund schools rather than raising costs for taxpayers. Both are true, but the first makes it sound positive, while the second makes it seem burdensome. Framing can also change moral decisions. Imagine a study that presents two scenarios, one where a new drug will save 200 out of 600 people, and another where 400 people will die. The second sounds much worse, even though both say the same thing. Research shows people are more likely to support the drug in the first framing because it focuses on saving lives rather than losing them. This effect extends to social issues as well. Consider how charities ask for donations. One might say, your donation helps provide food for 1,000 families, while another might say, without your help, 1,000 families will go hungry. The second message triggers a stronger emotional response. Even though both communicate the same need, people are more likely to donate when they feel responsible for preventing harm. In legal settings, framing can affect jury decisions. A defense lawyer may describe a crime as an unfortunate mistake, while the prosecution may call it a reckless act. These descriptions shape how jurors interpret the same event. Studies show that changing a single word can influence verdicts. When a car accident is described as a collision, people estimate lower speeds than when it is called a crash. In healthcare, doctors and patients make different choices depending on how risks are framed. A treatment that helps 95 out of 100 patients recover sounds more effective than one that fails for 5 out of 100 patients, even though both mean the same thing. In public health campaigns, experts frame messages to encourage healthier behavior. Telling people, quitting smoking adds years to your life, is more effective than saying, smoking shortens your life. People respond more positively to gains than losses. Framing also affects memory. If someone describes a past event as a challenge we overcame, it feels different than a disaster we barely survived. The words people use to describe their experiences shape how they remember them. This applies to news coverage as well. A headline that says stock market drops 5 cents sounds worse than market experiences a 5% correction. The second implies a natural adjustment, while the first suggests danger. Even job interviews and performance reviews are affected by framing. If a hiring manager describes a candidate as 80% qualified, they may seem like a good choice. But if the same candidate is labeled as 20% unqualified, they may not seem like the right fit. Employees receiving feedback react differently based on how it is framed. Being told, "You improved by 30%, feels more motivating than hearing, "You are still 70% below the target." This bias shapes relationships as well. When discussing an argument, someone might say, "We had a disagreement, but we worked through it." Or they might say, "We fought, and it was difficult to recover." Both statements describe the same event, but they lead to different emotional responses. Couples who frame their conflicts in a positive light tend to feel more satisfied in their relationships. Even parenting decisions are influenced by framing. A parent who tells a child, "If you study, you'll increase your chances of getting into a good college," creates a different motivation than saying, "If you don't study, you'll ruin your future." Both messages aim to encourage studying, but the first promotes a positive vision while the second instills fear. Sports teams and coaches use framing to build confidence. A coach who tells players, "You have a strong record against this team," boosts morale more than saying, "You've lost a few games, but you can still win." The words shape how athletes perceive their chances. Cognitive biases like the framing effect operate in the background of daily decisions, shaping choices without people realizing it. Even experts fall for it. A seasoned investor may still react emotionally to how a stock's performance is framed. A doctor may recommend a procedure based on how risks are presented in a medical study. A policymaker may support a law based on how statistics are framed rather than the actual data. Understanding this bias helps people make more informed choices. The next time a decision feels obvious, it's worth asking, am I choosing this because of the facts or because of how it was presented? Looking at both the positive and negative framing of any issue reveals the full picture. Recognizing when framing is at play allows for better decision-making in everything from personal finance to health and relationships. Survivorship bias happens when people focus on success stories and ignore failures. This can lead to false conclusions about how the world works. It is a natural tendency because we usually hear about winners, not losers. The stories of failure often go unnoticed, making success seem easier than it really is. Imagine a group of entrepreneurs who started businesses in the same year. 5 years later, only a few of them are still running companies. These entrepreneurs are invited to give talks, write books, and share their secrets to success. They say things like, hard work pays off, and never give up. Their stories make it seem like anyone can succeed if they just try hard enough. But what about those who failed? Maybe they worked just as hard, had great ideas, and took smart risks, yet they didn't make it. Their stories are missing from the conversation, creating an illusion that success is more common than it is. This bias shows up in many areas of life, including business, education, investing, and even war. Consider World War II. The Allies wanted to reinforce their planes to make them more likely to survive enemy fire. They studied returning planes and found bullet holes concentrated in the wings and fuselage. They planned to add armor to these spots, but a statistician named Abraham Wald pointed out something important. The planes they studied had survived. The ones that didn't make it back were hit in different places, likely in the engines or cockpit. By focusing only on surviving planes, they almost made the wrong decision. Instead, they reinforced the areas where there were no bullet holes, improving survival rates. This kind of thinking also affects how people view careers. Many dream of becoming professional athletes, musicians, or actors. They see those who made it big and assume talent and hard work guarantee success. But for everyone who makes it, thousands fail. The stories of those who didn't succeed are invisible. Some had talent, some worked just as hard, but they never got the right opportunity, had bad luck, or faced obstacles beyond their control. Survivorship bias makes people believe that if they just follow the right steps, they will succeed. In reality, luck and circumstances play a bigger role than most realize. Investing is another place where survivorship bias misleads people. When people look at the stock market, they see companies that survived and thrived. They assume investing is a sure path to wealth because the data they see shows companies growing over time. But they don't see the businesses that failed. Many companies don't last. Investors who only look at survivors assume stocks are always a great investment. In reality, many companies go bankrupt, and not every investment succeeds. Fitness and health advice often suffer from the same problem. People look at elite athletes and fitness influencers for advice on diet and exercise. They see the ones who achieved their goals and assume that following their routines will lead to the same results. But these individuals may have genetic advantages, unique lifestyles, or access to resources that others don't. The people who tried the same methods but didn't see results are not part of the conversation. This creates unrealistic expectations and false beliefs about what is possible. The same happens in education. Many successful people credit their achievements to their schools, teachers, or degrees. They say education gave them the tools to succeed. But what about those who went to the same schools, had the same teachers, earned the same degrees, and still struggled? Their stories go unheard. Survivorship bias makes people think a certain path leads to success, when in reality, many factors contribute to an outcome. Even in relationships, this bias can shape beliefs. People see happy couples who have been together for years and assume they have the perfect formula for love. They may say that communication, trust, and compromise are the keys to a lasting relationship. But they don't hear from those who did all these things and still ended up divorced. Relationships fail for many reasons, and not all of them are within a person's control. Ignoring the failed relationships creates a skewed view of what makes love last. The entertainment industry also reinforces this bias. Movie stars, musicians, and authors often talk about how they never gave up on their dreams. Their success stories inspire others, but the thousands who tried just as hard and never made it remain invisible. This makes it seem like persistence guarantees success. It does not. Many factors, including timing, connections, and luck, play a role. The same bias affects how people view self-help advice. Many books promise success by following a set of principles. They use examples of people who achieved great things, claiming these methods work for everyone. But they don't include those who followed the advice and failed. This creates the illusion that success is within reach for anyone willing to put in the effort. It ignores the role of chance, privilege, and circumstances. Even in technology and innovation, this bias misleads people. Startups that become massive companies often get studied as models of success. People assume their strategies were the key factors. But what about the thousands of startups that followed similar strategies and failed? They are invisible. This makes it seem like success is about making the right choices when, in reality, survival depends on many uncontrollable elements. This bias also plays a role in historical narratives. People remember great leaders, inventors, and pioneers. They hear stories of individuals who changed the world through brilliance and determination. But history forgets those who tried and failed. The focus on survivors makes it seem like success is common when, in reality, most attempts at greatness do not succeed. Survivorship bias influences how people judge risk. If they only see the winners, they assume risks are lower than they actually are. This leads to overconfidence. They may take on business ventures, investments, or life decisions with unrealistic expectations. When they fail, they wonder what went wrong, not realizing the odds were never as good as they seemed. It even shapes how people view advice from mentors and successful individuals. People listen to those who made it and assume their wisdom is universal, but their advice is based on personal experiences, which may not apply to everyone. They don't hear from those who followed similar paths and didn't succeed. This makes success seem more predictable than it really is. The military, science, sports, and almost every field suffer from this bias. Anytime failures are ignored, people get a distorted view of reality. They assume surviving examples tell the whole story. But success is rare, and many factors contribute to an outcome. Understanding this bias helps people make better decisions. Instead of only studying winners, they should also look at failures. They should ask what went wrong, what challenges people faced, and what factors were beyond their control. By considering both sides, they get a clearer picture of how the world works. Survivorship bias makes success seem easy, common, and predictable. In reality, it is often rare, difficult, and shaped by factors people don't see. Recognizing this bias helps people set realistic expectations and avoid being misled by incomplete information. The sunk cost fallacy happens when people continue with a decision because they have already invested time, money, or effort, even if the best choice is to walk away. The mistake comes from thinking past costs should influence future decisions, when in reality, those costs are gone and can't be recovered. The rational choice is to base decisions on what will bring the best results going forward, not on what has already been spent. Imagine someone buys a ticket for a concert, but on the day of the event, they feel sick. They don't want to waste the money they spent, so they go anyway, even though they won't enjoy the concert and may feel worse afterward. The money is already spent, but their decision to attend makes their situation worse rather than better. Consider another example. A company invests millions in developing a new product. A few years in, they realize a competitor has already created something better and cheaper. The smart move would be to cut their losses and shift resources to something more profitable. But executives feel reluctant to abandon the project because of how much has already been spent, so they keep pouring money into it, hoping to justify the earlier investment. In the end, they lose even more money than if they had stopped when they first saw the warning signs. The same thinking affects personal relationships. Someone might stay in a failing relationship because they've already spent years with their partner. They believe leaving would mean wasting all that time, But if the relationship isn't working, staying just because of the time invested only leads to more unhappiness. Gambling provides another clear example. A person at a casino loses $500 at the blackjack table. Instead of stopping, they keep playing because they want to win back what they lost. The more they lose, the more determined they become. Their logic is flawed, the money is gone, and continuing to gamble doesn't increase their chances of winning it back. But their focus on recovering their losses makes them risk even more. Movies, books, and TV shows also trigger the sunk cost fallacy. Someone starts a long, boring movie. Halfway through, they realize they don't like it, but they keep watching because they've already invested time in it. The rational choice would be to stop and do something enjoyable instead. But the sunk cost fallacy convinces them to finish, even though they get nothing from it. This fallacy affects education and career choices too. A student might spend years studying for a degree they realize they don't enjoy. They feel they have come too far to quit, so they push through, even though switching fields would make them happier. The same happens in jobs. Someone stays in a career they dislike because they've already spent years working their way up. Instead of making a fresh start, they stay trapped in a role they don't enjoy. Governments fall into this trap as well. Large public projects often go over budget, but instead of stopping, officials keep funding them because they don't want to admit failure. Military conflicts sometimes follow the same pattern. A country engages in a war, realizes it isn't going as planned, but continues because they don't want their earlier efforts to be for nothing. The key to avoiding this mistake is recognizing that past investments should not dictate future decisions. A better way to think is to ask, if I were making this choice for the first time today, knowing what I know now, what would I do? If the answer is to walk away, then past investments don't matter. Understanding the sunk cost fallacy helps in everyday life. It allows people to step back and make choices based on current and future benefits rather than past expenses. The most valuable resources, time, energy, and money, should go where they have the highest return, not where they have already been spent. The bandwagon effect happens when people adopt beliefs, opinions, or behaviors simply because many others do. This effect influences decisions in politics, consumer behavior, and even personal choices. It shapes how people think and act, often without them realizing it. Imagine a new social media app gains popularity. At first, only a few people use it, but as more join, others follow. Many users may not even evaluate whether the app suits their needs. They see friends using it and assume it must be worthwhile. The desire to belong drives them to sign up, even if they have no real interest in the platform. This is the bandwagon effect in action. Political movements often rely on this tendency. During elections, people sometimes vote for a candidate simply because they appear to be the frontrunner. Polls and media coverage create momentum, and many assume the popular choice must be the right one. Instead of carefully considering policies or values, they follow the crowd. This effect can lead to political trends that shift quickly. A candidate who was once overlooked can suddenly surge in popularity when enough people start supporting them. The bandwagon effect also plays a major role in marketing. Companies use it to sell products by making them seem popular. When people see long lines outside a store or read about an item selling out, they assume it must be valuable. They may not need the product, but they feel compelled to buy it because so many others are doing the same. This happens with fashion trends as well. A clothing style that was once ignored can become a must-have item once celebrities and influencers start wearing it. The popularity itself becomes the selling point, and soon stores struggle to keep up with demand. Financial markets provide another example of how the bandwagon effect influences behavior. Stock prices often rise when many investors start buying, even if there is no solid reason for the increase. People see others investing and fear missing out, so they join in. This can create economic bubbles where prices soar far beyond actual value. When the bubble bursts, those who joined late often suffer losses. The bandwagon effect fuels both market booms and crashes because investors rely more on crowd behavior than rational analysis. The workplace is not immune to this tendency. Employees often adopt opinions or behaviors that seem widely accepted within their company. If management promotes a new initiative, Workers may support it simply because their colleagues do. They might not evaluate whether it improves efficiency or benefits them personally. This effect can lead to groupthink, where teams make poor decisions because no one wants to challenge the dominant opinion. When everyone follows the majority without questioning, critical thinking suffers. Entertainment choices also reflect this effect. Movies, books, and TV shows often gain popularity because of social momentum. A film that gets strong opening weekend sales is likely to attract even more viewers. The perception of success convinces people that it must be worth watching. The same applies to music. A song that charts well gains more radio play, streaming, and downloads, reinforcing its popularity. Sometimes, people enjoy content simply because they believe they should, not because it actually appeals to them. Social interactions demonstrate this effect in everyday life. When a new slang term or phrase becomes common, people start using it without questioning why. The same happens with opinions on current events. If a certain viewpoint gains traction, many adopt it without fully understanding the issue. This effect helps ideas spread quickly, but it also means misinformation can take hold. If enough people believe something, others assume it must be true, even if it lacks evidence. Sports fandom provides another clear example. People often support a team because of its recent success. A championship win can attract many new fans who were previously indifferent. These fans may not have deep loyalty to the team, but they join in because of the excitement. When the team struggles, many of these same fans lose interest and move on. Their support was based on popularity rather than personal connection. Consumer reviews demonstrate how this effect shapes opinions. A product with many positive ratings is more likely to attract buyers. People assume that if others like it, they will too. Sometimes this leads to inflated expectations. If a product has overwhelmingly positive reviews, buyers may overlook flaws they would normally notice. The belief that it must be good influences their perception. The bandwagon effect also affects lifestyle choices. Diet trends show how people adopt behaviors based on popularity rather than personal research. A certain way of eating may gain attention because celebrities endorse it. People start following the trend without fully understanding its benefits or risks. They trust the crowd's judgment over their own independent evaluation. The way people respond to social issues reflects this effect as well. When a cause gains widespread attention, many express support simply because it is popular. They may not have engaged with the issue before, but seeing others discuss it compels them to join in. This can be positive when it raises awareness, but it can also lead to superficial engagement. Some people support movements without fully understanding them, treating them more like trends than serious causes. Technology adoption follows a similar pattern. A new device or service may gain traction because of its popularity rather than its actual usefulness. Many people buy the latest phone, not because they need its features, but because others have it. Seeing friends upgrade creates pressure to do the same. The product's success reinforces itself, even if there are better alternatives available. This effect even extends to personal habits. If a new fitness craze becomes popular, many people start participating, even if it does not suit their lifestyle. They join because of social influence rather than a genuine interest. Over time, they may lose motivation because their initial reason for starting was external rather than internal. Religious and cultural practices also show how the bandwagon effect influences behavior. Many traditions persist because they are widely followed, not necessarily because individuals deeply believe in them. People participate in customs because they see others doing so, even if they do not fully understand the meaning behind them. This effect helps preserve cultural practices, but can also discourage critical reflection. The same principle applies to opinions on art and literature. A book or painting that critics praise often becomes widely admired, even by those who might not have appreciated it otherwise. People assume that if experts or the general public approve, it must be valuable. This influences how they interpret and experience creative works. The bandwagon effect plays a role in moral judgments as well. If a behavior becomes widely accepted, people may stop questioning whether it is right or wrong. Social norms shift based on what the majority deems acceptable. This can lead to progress, but it can also reinforce harmful beliefs. When enough people endorse something, dissenting voices become rare, making it harder to challenge prevailing ideas. Trends in education show how this effect shapes learning preferences. If a new teaching method gains widespread use, schools may adopt it without strong evidence of its effectiveness. Educators follow the trend because others are doing the same. This can lead to fads in education, where methods are implemented without thorough evaluation. The effect also appears in online discussions. When a topic goes viral, people join the conversation without always considering its merit. They share opinions and articles because others are doing so, often without verifying the accuracy of the information. This creates echo chambers where ideas spread rapidly but are not always based on facts. Even in health decisions, the bandwagon effect can be powerful. Alternative treatments and wellness trends gain followers because they are popular, not because they are scientifically proven. People try them because they see others doing so, sometimes ignoring medical advice in the process. The tendency to follow the crowd is deeply ingrained in human behavior. It influences choices in ways that often go unnoticed. Recognizing this effect can help people make more independent decisions. When individuals pause to consider whether they truly believe in something or are simply following others, they gain greater control over their thoughts and actions. The gambler's fallacy happens when people believe past random events affect future probabilities. This mistake comes from a misunderstanding of how chance and randomness work. When someone assumes that past results can predict future outcomes in situations ruled by chance, they fall into this trap. Many gamblers, investors, and even everyday decision-makers fall for this thinking without realizing it. Imagine a person at a roulette table in a casino. They notice that the last 5 spins landed on black. They feel convinced that the next spin must land on red because black has come up too many times in a row. In reality, each spin is independent. The ball does not remember where it landed before. The odds of hitting red or black stay the same. Yet the gambler falsely believes past outcomes influence the future. A common example appears in coin flipping. Suppose you flip a fair coin 5 times, and it lands on heads every time. Many people assume that the next flip is more likely to be tails because heads has appeared too often. In reality, the chance of getting heads or tails remains 50% with each flip. The past results do not change the fundamental probabilities. Casinos benefit from this mistake. In games like roulette or craps, players believe patterns exist where none do. They think a slot machine is due for a jackpot after a long losing streak. This thinking leads people to make poor bets, often losing more money than they intend. The house edge remains unchanged no matter how many times a game has been played. This fallacy also appears outside of gambling. In sports, fans sometimes believe a team that has lost multiple games in a row is due for a win. While it is true that teams may improve over time or adjust their strategy, the losses themselves do not increase the chances of winning the next game. If the team remains weaker than its opponent, losing remains just as likely. Financial markets show similar thinking. Some investors assume that a stock that has been falling for days must go back up soon. While markets do experience cycles, a downward trend does not guarantee a reversal. A company in decline can continue falling despite past performance. Assuming otherwise can lead to risky investments and financial losses. The origin of this fallacy may come from the human tendency to look for patterns. People prefer order over randomness. They expect events to balance out in the short term, even when no natural balancing force exists. This belief leads them to assume a streak of one outcome must be followed by its opposite, though probability does not work this way. Randomness does not create balance in the short term. If you roll a fair die 6 times, you might not see each number appear once. You might roll a 6 3 times in a row. This does not mean the next roll is less likely to be a 6. Each roll remains a separate event with the same probability. The gambler's fallacy can cause stress and frustration. A person who believes they are due for good luck may keep making bad decisions, hoping for an outcome that never comes. This thinking leads to bigger losses, whether in gambling, investing, or everyday choices. One way to avoid this mistake is to remember that independent events do not influence each other. If an outcome is truly random, past results do not affect future probabilities. Recognizing this fact helps people make better decisions based on logic rather than false patterns. Negativity bias shapes the way people see the world. It makes them focus on bad experiences more than good ones. A single negative event can outweigh several positive ones. This bias influences decisions, emotions, and behavior without people realizing it. It is a built-in survival mechanism that once helped early humans avoid danger. Today, it affects everything from relationships to financial choices. Imagine a person giving a presentation at work. Most of the feedback is positive, but one person criticizes a small detail. Instead of feeling good about the praise, the presenter fixates on the one criticism. The positive comments fade into the background while the negative one takes center stage. That is negativity bias in action. The brain prioritizes negative information because it perceives it as more important. Consider another scenario. A person receives a performance review at their job. The manager lists several strengths but also points out one area for improvement. Instead of remembering the praise, the employee dwells on the weakness. They replay the comment in their head for days, wondering if they are failing. Even though the review was mostly positive, the single critique overshadows everything else. This bias also plays a role in relationships. A couple can have many good moments together, but one argument can feel more significant than weeks of happiness. A partner might remember a hurtful comment for years, even if it was said in the heat of the moment. The brain treats the negative experience as more meaningful than the positive ones. This happens because negative experiences trigger stronger emotional reactions, making them more memorable. News and media take advantage of negativity bias. People pay more attention to bad news than good news. A single tragic event can dominate the headlines for days, even if thousands of good things happen at the same time. If a person watches the news regularly, they might start believing the world is more dangerous than it really is. Crime rates might be dropping, but because bad news gets more coverage, it feels like things are getting worse. Negativity bias influences financial decisions. If a person loses money on an investment, they may become hesitant to invest again, even if the odds of success are in their favor. The pain of loss feels stronger than the joy of gain. This is why some people avoid risks, even when the potential rewards are high. It also explains why a single financial setback can make someone feel like a failure, even if they have had many successes. Social media amplifies negativity bias. People are more likely to engage with posts that make them angry or upset. Platforms take advantage of this by promoting content that triggers strong emotions. A single negative comment on a post can stand out more than dozens of positive ones. This can lead to a distorted view of reality, where the world seems more hostile than it actually is. Negativity bias affects self-perception. If a person makes a mistake, they may dwell on it and forget their achievements. A student who does well on most exams but fails one might see themselves as a failure. A person who stumbles during a speech might believe they are terrible at public speaking, even if most of the presentation went well. This bias makes people undervalue their strengths and overemphasize their flaws. It also plays a role in decision-making. If a person has a bad experience with a restaurant, they may never go back, even if it was just one bad meal. The negative memory outweighs any good ones. This can lead to avoiding things that could be enjoyable or beneficial. It makes people more cautious, sometimes to their own detriment. Childhood experiences shape how negativity bias develops. If a child grows up in a critical environment, they may become more sensitive to negative feedback. They might develop a habit of expecting criticism, even when none is present. This can carry into adulthood, making them more likely to focus on negative experiences. Negativity bias can also affect mental health. People with anxiety or depression often experience it more intensely. They may struggle to see positive aspects of their lives because their minds focus on what is wrong. This can create a cycle where they expect bad things to happen, reinforcing their negative outlook. Understanding negativity bias helps people manage it. If a person notices themselves dwelling on a negative comment, they can consciously remind themselves of positive feedback they have received. If bad news makes them feel hopeless, they can look for positive stories to balance their perspective. Recognizing the bias does not eliminate it, but it helps reduce its impact. People can also train their minds to counteract negativity bias. One way is by keeping a journal of positive experiences. Writing down good things that happen each day helps shift focus away from negative thoughts. Another way is by practicing gratitude. Regularly acknowledging things to be grateful for can help rewire the brain to notice positive aspects of life. Negativity bias is not always harmful. It helps people learn from mistakes and avoid dangerous situations. If someone gets scammed once, they become more cautious in the future. If a driver almost gets into an accident, they might become more careful on the road. The problem arises when negativity bias distorts reality, making the world seem worse than it is. In relationships, people can counter negativity bias by focusing on positive interactions. If a couple argues, they can remind themselves of the good moments they have shared. If a friend makes a hurtful comment, remembering their kindness in the past can help put things in perspective. Consciously shifting focus to positive memories can reduce the impact of negative ones. When making decisions, being aware of negativity bias can help people make better choices. If fear of failure is stopping someone from trying something new, they can remind themselves of past successes. If a bad experience is clouding judgment, looking at the bigger picture can provide a more balanced view. Businesses can also benefit from understanding negativity bias. A single bad customer experience can have a bigger impact than many good ones. This is why companies put so much effort into handling complaints. Negative reviews carry more weight than positive ones. A satisfied customer might not leave a review, but an unhappy one is likely to share their experience. Businesses that recognize this can take steps to ensure that negative experiences do not define their reputation. Negativity bias also shapes political opinions. A single scandal can damage a politician's reputation more than years of good work can improve it. Voters may remember one bad policy decision more than many good ones. Political campaigns often use this to their advantage by highlighting opponents' failures instead of focusing on their own successes. When people understand how negativity bias works, they can take steps to lessen its effects. Recognizing when it is happening is the first step. Consciously seeking out positive experiences, keeping things in perspective, and challenging negative thoughts can help balance the mind's natural tendency to focus on the bad. Negativity bias is a powerful force, but it does not have to control the way people see the world. The optimism bias is the tendency to believe that positive outcomes are more likely to happen to you than to others. This bias makes people underestimate risks and overestimate their chances of success. It affects decisions in everyday life, from financial planning to health choices. Imagine someone starting a business. They believe their idea is unique, their execution will be flawless, and customers will flock to them. They see themselves as the exception to the rule. They ignore the fact that most startups fail within the first 5 years. When asked about their chances of success, they say something like, "I know the risks, but I have a great idea. I'll be different." They don't just hope for the best, they assume it. Optimism bias also shows up in personal finance. People assume they will save more money in the future even if they struggle to save today. They believe their income will rise steadily, that they will avoid major financial setbacks, and that they will retire comfortably. They don't think about unexpected expenses, job loss, or medical emergencies. Because of this, they may fail to save enough or take on too much debt. When things don't go as planned, they feel blindsided. Health is another area where optimism bias appears. A person might smoke, eat poorly, or skip exercise because they believe they won't suffer the negative effects others do. If they see a friend get sick due to poor habits, they think, "That won't happen to me." This mindset leads people to delay doctor visits, ignore symptoms, or fail to make preventive lifestyle changes. Optimism bias is not just an individual issue. It affects how societies plan for the future. Governments and companies often underestimate costs and overestimate benefits. Large infrastructure projects regularly go over budget because planners assume best-case scenarios. A city building a new subway system might expect it to be completed in 5 years at a set cost. In reality, delays, unforeseen issues, and higher material costs push both the timeline and budget much further than expected. The same bias plays a role in climate change discussions. Many people assume that new technology or government policies will solve the problem without requiring major lifestyle changes. They think someone else will take care of it, so they don't take personal action. Even when faced with overwhelming evidence, they believe the worst effects won't happen in their lifetime. Optimism bias affects relationships too. When people get married, they believe their relationship will last, even though many marriages end in divorce. They think they are different from other couples. If asked about their chances of divorce, they estimate much lower odds than the statistics show. This belief may lead them to overlook problems or avoid discussing difficult topics like finances or expectations. People in risky professions also experience this bias. A firefighter, police officer, or soldier knows their job is dangerous. They have seen others get hurt or worse. But when they think about their own safety, they believe they will be fine. They acknowledge the risks but don't fully apply them to themselves. This mindset helps them do their jobs without fear, but it can also lead them to take unnecessary risks. Optimism bias affects how people approach deadlines. A student working on a project assumes they will have plenty of time to finish, even if they have a history of procrastination. They tell themselves they will start early, work consistently, and submit their best work. In reality, they wait until the last minute and scramble to complete it. They didn't account for distractions, other responsibilities, or unexpected difficulties. This bias also appears in investing. An investor buys stocks believing they will rise in value, even when markets are unpredictable. They see past successes as proof that they will continue to make good decisions. If the market crashes, they are shocked. They didn't think it would happen to them. They might even double down, assuming the market will recover faster than it actually does. Optimism bias can have benefits. It keeps people motivated and hopeful. It helps them take on challenges they might otherwise avoid. If people only focused on risks, they might never start businesses, get married, or try new things. Optimism gives them confidence to move forward despite uncertainty. However, unchecked optimism can lead to poor decision-making. People may take on too much risk, fail to prepare for setbacks, or ignore warning signs. The best way to counter optimism bias is to recognize it. When making plans, people should ask themselves, what if things don't go as expected? They should consider worst-case scenarios and prepare accordingly. One way to do this is through pre-mortem thinking, imagining that a plan has already failed and working backward to figure out why. A person planning a big project could ask, if this fails, what would have caused it? By thinking this way, they can identify potential obstacles and address them in advance. Another strategy is seeking outside perspectives. When people plan, they often focus on their own experiences and beliefs. Talking to others who have faced similar situations can provide a more realistic picture. If someone wants to start a business, they should speak with entrepreneurs who have struggled, as well as those who have succeeded. Historical data can also help counter optimism bias. Instead of assuming things will go well, people can look at what has happened in similar situations. If 80% of businesses fail, they should assume their chances are similar unless they take concrete steps to improve them. Setting concrete, measurable goals with clear deadlines can also help. Instead of saying, I'll save more money next year, a person should say, I will save $200 a month. This approach forces them to take action rather than just hoping for the best. Accountability is another useful tool. Sharing plans with others makes people more likely to follow through. A person who tells a friend, I will exercise 3 times a week, is more likely to do it than someone who keeps it to themselves. Optimism bias will always be part of human thinking. It helps people stay positive, but it also causes them to overlook risks. Recognizing this bias and taking steps to counter it can lead to better decisions and fewer surprises. The actor-observer bias is the tendency to explain other people's behavior as a result of their personality while explaining our own behavior as a result of external circumstances. This happens because we see the world from our own perspective. When we judge others, we focus on what they do. When we judge ourselves, we focus on what we experience. Imagine someone cuts you off in traffic. You immediately think they are rude, reckless, or even a bad driver. Now, imagine you do the same thing to someone else. Instead of blaming yourself, you might justify it by saying you were in a rush, you didn't see them, or you had an urgent reason. The same action occurs, but the explanation changes depending on whether you are the one doing it or the one observing. This bias appears in everyday situations. Think about a student who fails an exam. If it's a classmate, they might assume the student didn't study, wasn't smart enough, or wasn't serious about the course. But if they fail the exam themselves, they might blame the difficulty of the questions, the teacher's unfair grading, or a lack of sleep the night before. At work, the same pattern appears. If a coworker misses a deadline, their peers might think they are lazy, disorganized, or not committed to their job. But if they miss a deadline themselves, they might point to an overload of work, unclear instructions, or technical issues. They don't apply the same judgment to themselves as they do to their coworkers. This bias also affects relationships. If a friend forgets to respond to a text, a person might assume they are ignoring them or don't care enough. If they forget to respond to a text themselves, they might explain it by saying they were busy, distracted, or meant to reply later, but forgot. It extends to emotions as well. If someone seems upset, we might think they are an irritable person. But if we feel upset, we recognize that something specific made us feel that way. We see our emotions as reactions to situations, but see others' emotions as reflections of their personality. This happens because of the way we process information. When we observe others, we focus on their actions because that's what we can see. We don't have access to their thoughts, emotions, or background circumstances. But when we think about our own behavior, we have access to all of that. We know why we acted a certain way, what pressures we felt, and what our intentions were. The bias is stronger in negative situations. When someone does something wrong, we are more likely to blame their character rather than consider their circumstances. But when we do something wrong, we defend ourselves by pointing to external factors. One common example is in customer service. If a cashier is short-tempered, a customer might assume they are rude. But if the customer is rude to the cashier, they might justify it by saying they had a long day or were frustrated by slow service. This bias also influences how people view crime. If someone hears about a theft, they might assume the thief is a bad person. But if they were ever caught shoplifting as a teenager, they might explain it as a mistake, peer pressure, or a desperate moment. It even plays a role in politics. If a politician from the opposing party makes a controversial statement, people assume they are ignorant, corrupt, or selfish. But if a politician they support makes a similar statement, they justify it as a misunderstanding, media distortion, or a strategic move. This bias is not intentional. People don't consciously decide to judge others unfairly. It happens naturally because of how the mind processes behavior. When we observe others, we see what they do, but not why they do it. When we analyze our own behavior, we see the whole picture, including our emotions, challenges, and justifications. It also occurs because we rely on past patterns. If we believe someone is unreliable, we are more likely to assume they are at fault when something goes wrong. But if we see ourselves as responsible, we are more likely to excuse our own mistakes as rare exceptions. This bias can cause misunderstandings. It makes people judge others too harshly while letting themselves off the hook. It can lead to conflict in relationships, workplaces, and social interactions. If people assume the worst about others but expect others to understand their own challenges, it creates frustration on both sides. It can also lead to unfair treatment. If a manager assumes an employee's poor performance is due to laziness rather than external struggles, they might not offer help or support. If a teacher assumes a student's struggles are due to lack of effort rather than personal challenges, they might not give them the benefit of the doubt. In some cases, the bias is reversed. People sometimes explain their own successes as a result of their skills and effort, while explaining others' successes as luck or external help. If someone gets a promotion, they might believe it's because they worked hard. But if a coworker gets a promotion, they might assume it's due to favoritism or good timing. Cultural differences can influence how this bias appears. In some cultures, people are more likely to see behavior as a reflection of circumstances rather than personality. In others, people tend to assume actions reflect character. This affects how blame, praise, and judgment are distributed in different societies. Awareness of this bias can help people become more fair and understanding. Before jumping to conclusions about others, it helps to consider possible reasons for their behavior. Instead of assuming someone is rude, irresponsible, or careless, it helps to ask whether they might be dealing with challenges we don't see. It also helps to apply the same standard to ourselves. If we expect others to understand our mistakes as circumstantial, we should try to extend the same understanding to them. This can improve relationships, communication, and overall fairness in how people judge each other. The actor-observer bias shapes how people interpret actions and make judgments about themselves and others. It influences personal, professional, and social interactions. By recognizing it, people can work toward a more balanced and fair perspective. The halo effect happens when one positive trait shapes the way we see everything about a person, brand, or thing. Instead of judging each part separately, we let that single good quality influence our whole perception. This bias affects daily decisions, relationships, and even major life choices without us realizing it. Picture a job interview. A candidate walks in, well-dressed, with a confident handshake and a friendly smile. The interviewer, impressed by this first impression, assumes the person is also competent, hardworking, and intelligent. They may overlook flaws in the candidate's answers, filling in gaps with assumptions instead of facts. The candidate might still be qualified, but the interviewer's positive impression was shaped mostly by superficial qualities. Another example happens in schools. A student who speaks well and answers confidently may be seen as more intelligent than a quieter classmate, even if their work is of the same quality. Teachers, like anyone else, are susceptible to this bias. They might grade a well-liked student's work more generously, thinking, "This student always does well," instead of assessing the work without prior impressions. Branding uses the halo effect all the time. If people love one product from a company, they often assume the rest of their products are just as good. A high-end phone brand releases headphones, and many assume they must be top quality, even if they have never used them. The same happens with celebrity endorsements. A famous athlete promoting a sneaker makes people believe the shoes must be high performance, even though the athlete had no role in designing them. The halo effect plays a big role in politics. A charismatic leader with a strong presence on stage may gain public trust even if their policies lack substance. People often assume that if someone is confident and well-spoken, they must also be capable and ethical. History shows many cases where this was not true. This bias even affects law and order. A well-dressed defendant with good manners may receive a lighter sentence compared to someone who looks rough or unkempt, even if both committed the same crime. Studies show that jurors and judges tend to be more lenient toward those who appear respectable. In everyday life, the halo effect influences relationships. A person who is physically attractive might be assumed to be kind, funny, or successful before they even speak. This bias explains why attractive people often receive more attention, opportunities, and positive treatment. It doesn't mean they aren't talented, but others may assume they are without evidence. Retailers use this effect to price items higher than they might be worth. A sleek package, a high price tag, and an association with luxury can make people believe a product is superior, even if a lower-priced alternative is just as good. The workplace is not free from this bias. A team member who speaks well and appears confident might be seen as more capable than someone quieter, even if their work output is the same. Performance reviews can be affected when a manager's overall impression of an employee colors their evaluation, making them overlook weak points or strengths. Friendships and social circles are also shaped by the halo effect. A person known for being generous may be assumed to be honest, even if there is no direct proof. The opposite can happen too. Someone perceived as rude once may be seen as unreliable in general, even if that judgment is unfair. This bias can have dangerous effects when applied to medical decisions. A respected doctor's recommendation might be followed without question, even when a second opinion could be beneficial. Patients may assume a doctor's confidence means their diagnosis is correct, even though medical errors do happen. The halo effect is hard to avoid because it happens quickly, often without conscious thought. It takes effort to slow down and assess people, products, and situations based on facts rather than assumptions. Noticing when this bias is at play helps in making fairer decisions, whether in hiring, friendships, purchases, or judgments about others. The horns effect happens when a single negative trait shapes how we see someone or something in a broad and unfair way. Instead of looking at the full picture, we let one flaw or mistake color our entire judgment. This can happen with people, brands, companies, or even ideas. Imagine a job interview where a candidate arrives 5 minutes late. The interviewer, who values punctuality, immediately assumes the candidate is unreliable and careless. Even if the candidate has a strong resume and answers every question well, the interviewer keeps focusing on that late arrival. Instead of considering other factors, they assume the candidate will always be late, always be unprepared, and always be a poor employee. The late arrival becomes the defining characteristic in the interviewer's mind. This is the horns effect in action. It also plays out in everyday life. Think about how people judge celebrities. If a public figure is caught in one scandal, it can overshadow their entire career. A respected athlete might make an offhanded, rude remark, and suddenly fans and the media brand them as arrogant or mean. People forget their past achievements and contributions, and instead, they focus only on that one mistake. The negative moment becomes their entire identity in the eyes of the public. This bias also happens in schools. A student who struggles with math may get labeled as lazy or unintelligent. Even if they excel in reading or science, teachers and peers might see them only through the lens of that one weakness. This can shape how they are treated, which in turn affects their confidence and performance. A student who feels boxed in by a single negative label may stop trying altogether, reinforcing the very assumption that led to the label in the first place. The horns effect appears in customer service as well. A single bad experience can taint someone's view of an entire company. Imagine ordering food at a restaurant and getting a rude waiter. Even if the food is excellent, you might leave with a bad impression of the entire place. You may assume all employees are rude, that the restaurant has bad management, or that the company does not value customers. The reality may be that the waiter was just having a rough day, but the negative moment shapes your entire judgment. In relationships, this bias can strain friendships and family dynamics. A friend who cancels plans at the last minute might be seen as flaky or uncaring. Instead of considering that they may have had a legitimate reason, their one action defines them. Over time, this perception can erode trust and goodwill. The person on the receiving end of the judgment may feel unfairly criticized, leading to tension or even the breakdown of the relationship. The workplace is another space where the horns effect creates problems. A single mistake in a presentation can make a boss or coworker see an employee as incompetent, even if they usually perform well. A manager might notice one careless error and start viewing everything that employee does through a negative lens. Instead of considering the full scope of their work, the manager focuses only on their weaknesses, making it harder for the employee to earn back trust or prove their capabilities. This bias can even influence hiring decisions. If a candidate has an unusual name or speaks with an accent, a hiring manager might unconsciously assume they are not a good fit. Instead of evaluating them based on skills or experience, the manager lets a minor detail shape their entire perception. Many people do not realize they are making these snap judgments, but they can have lasting effects on hiring practices and workplace diversity. Politics is another area where the horns effect thrives. If a politician makes one controversial statement, opponents may use it to define their entire career. Even if they have a long history of good work, that single moment can become the focus. Voters who disagree with them on one issue may dismiss everything else they stand for. This can make political debates feel more like battles of perception rather than discussions of actual policies. Advertising and branding also suffer from this bias. If a company releases one faulty product, customers may assume all their products are bad. A single PR disaster can tarnish a brand's reputation for years. Even if the company makes efforts to improve, people may continue associating them with that past failure. In some cases, businesses struggle to recover because of the lasting impact of one bad moment. Social media amplifies the horns effect. A person who posts one poorly worded tweet can face widespread backlash, even if their intent was not harmful. Online users often reduce individuals to a single action, ignoring the complexity of their character. Cancel culture thrives on this tendency, as people rush to judge based on a single post or comment without looking at the bigger picture. The horns effect even plays a role in personal self-perception. If someone has a bad experience trying something new, they might label themselves as bad at it forever. A person who struggles with public speaking once might conclude they are terrible at it, even if they just had an off day. They let one failure define their abilities, preventing themselves from improving. This bias shapes the way people interact with different cultures as well. If someone has a negative experience with a person from a particular background, they may unfairly assume everyone from that group behaves the same way. Stereotypes often stem from this type of thinking. Instead of seeing individuals as unique, people apply a single negative trait to an entire group, leading to discrimination and prejudice. Breaking free from the horns effect requires conscious effort. It starts with recognizing when snap judgments are happening. If someone catches themselves forming a negative opinion based on one trait, they can pause and ask whether they are considering the full picture. Questioning first impressions can help prevent unfair assumptions. Practicing empathy is another way to counter this bias. Instead of immediately labeling someone based on a single mistake, considering their perspective can lead to a more balanced view. Recognizing that people are complex and have good and bad moments can prevent overly harsh judgments. Another useful approach is gathering more information before forming an opinion. Instead of assuming one bad experience defines an entire person or company, looking at a broader range of experiences can provide a more accurate perspective. Seeking out different viewpoints helps challenge the tendency to focus only on the negative. People can also work to be more aware of how they describe others. Avoiding language that reduces someone to a single trait can help prevent reinforcing the horns effect. Instead of saying, "that coworker is always late," shifting to, "that coworker was late today," keeps the focus on specific behavior rather than generalizing. The horns effect is deeply ingrained in human thinking, but recognizing it can help limit its impact. By challenging quick judgments and considering people as a whole, rather than through a single flaw, it becomes easier to see the world in a more fair and accurate way. Overconfidence bias happens when people believe they know more than they actually do. It can show up in many ways, like overestimating abilities, underestimating risks, or assuming success without enough evidence. This bias affects decisions in everyday life, from simple tasks to big financial or business choices. People often trust their judgment too much, ignoring possible mistakes or overlooking missing information. Imagine a driver who has been on the road for years. He rarely checks blind spots because he believes he has excellent awareness. He assumes his reflexes and experience will keep him safe. One day, he changes lanes without looking, confident no one is there. A car honks and he barely avoids a collision. His overconfidence nearly caused an accident. This bias makes people ignore precautions, assuming they won't make mistakes. In workplaces, overconfidence can lead to poor decision-making. A manager might believe he understands a project so well that he skips research or dismisses expert advice. He assumes his plan is flawless. When unexpected problems arise, he scrambles to fix them. Had he acknowledged the possibility of being wrong, he might have planned better. Many failed businesses started with overconfident leaders who assumed their ideas would succeed without testing or adjusting them. Investing provides another clear example. A person new to the stock market reads about a company and decides to invest everything. He believes he has found a sure winner. He ignores financial reports, skips professional advice, and assumes his gut feeling is enough. When the stock drops, he is shocked. His overconfidence led him to ignore key information that could have helped him make a smarter choice. This bias is not limited to specific fields. It can affect medical decisions, academic performance, and even social interactions. A student who barely studies might assume he knows the material well enough to pass a test. He takes the exam and realizes too late that he wasn't as prepared as he thought. A doctor might diagnose a patient quickly, believing his experience makes him infallible. If he ignores symptoms that don't fit his initial assumption, he risks making a dangerous mistake. One reason people fall into this bias is that confidence feels good. Doubt can be uncomfortable. People prefer to feel sure about their choices, even when they lack information. This can be reinforced when past decisions turned out well, even if luck played a role. Success can make people assume they will always be right in the future. Another reason is that people often focus on what they know while ignoring what they don't. If someone has read a few articles on a topic, they might feel well informed. They forget that experts spend years studying the same subject. This can lead to dismissing expert opinions or assuming research is unnecessary. People don't like admitting gaps in their knowledge, so they overestimate how much they truly understand. The way people receive feedback also plays a role. If someone succeeds despite a risky decision, they might believe they were right all along. This reinforces overconfidence. However, failure is often blamed on external factors rather than personal mistakes. A gambler who loses money might blame bad luck rather than poor choices. This prevents learning and allows overconfidence to persist. Technology has made this bias more widespread. With easy access to information, people assume they can become instant experts. Someone reading a few articles online might think they understand medicine better than a doctor. This leads to misinformation and poor decisions. The internet provides knowledge, but it does not replace deep expertise. People who don't recognize this risk making serious errors. Overconfidence also affects memory. People often remember being right more often than they actually were. If someone recalls past predictions, they might focus on the ones that turned out correct while forgetting the mistakes. This selective memory strengthens overconfidence. It creates a false sense of accuracy, making people believe they are better at predicting outcomes than they really are. One of the most damaging effects of overconfidence is the failure to prepare. When people assume they will succeed, they skip important steps. A student who believes a test will be easy may not study enough. A business owner confident in his product may ignore market research. An athlete who assumes victory might train less. In each case, overconfidence leads to a lack of effort, increasing the risk of failure. Overconfidence can also cause conflicts. When people believe they are always right, they dismiss opposing views. This can lead to arguments, stubbornness, and poor teamwork. A leader who refuses to listen to subordinates might make choices that hurt a company. A politician who assumes he knows best might ignore expert warnings, leading to bad policies. When overconfidence prevents people from considering other perspectives, it creates problems that could have been avoided. In extreme cases, overconfidence can have serious consequences. Pilots, doctors, engineers, and military leaders must make high-stakes decisions. If they assume they cannot be wrong, they might overlook warnings or take unnecessary risks. Many disasters have occurred because someone trusted their judgment too much. Airplane crashes, medical errors, and financial crises have all been linked to overconfidence in decision-making. One way to reduce overconfidence is by seeking feedback. Asking others to challenge assumptions can expose blind spots. Encouraging open discussions helps people see different viewpoints. Fact-checking decisions before acting can also reduce mistakes. Writing down reasons for a choice and then revisiting them later can reveal whether confidence was justified or misplaced. Another method is considering worst-case scenarios. If someone assumes success, they should ask themselves what would happen if they were wrong. What risks are they overlooking? What backup plans could they create? Thinking about failure forces people to prepare better. This approach is used in fields like engineering and medicine, where overconfidence can be dangerous. Keeping track of past decisions can also help. If someone records predictions and checks their accuracy later, they may notice patterns. They might realize they overestimated their knowledge multiple times. This awareness can help them adjust future decisions. A simple habit like writing down investment choices and reviewing them later can show whether confidence was warranted. Acknowledging uncertainty is another useful strategy. Recognizing that no one has perfect knowledge helps prevent overconfidence. Experts often say things like, "I'm not sure, but here's what I think," based on the evidence. This approach encourages careful thinking rather than blind confidence. Admitting gaps in knowledge does not make someone weak, it makes them realistic. Overconfidence is a common bias that affects many areas of life. It leads to poor decisions, unnecessary risks, and avoidable mistakes. People often believe they know more than they do, leading to failures that could have been prevented. Recognizing this bias helps individuals make better choices, seek advice, and prepare for uncertainty. Simple habits like questioning assumptions, considering risks, and reviewing past decisions can reduce overconfidence and improve judgment. The availability heuristic affects how people judge the likelihood of events. When something comes to mind quickly, people assume it happens more often. This happens because the brain takes shortcuts when making decisions. Instead of carefully analyzing all the facts, it relies on information that is easy to recall. The more recent or emotionally charged something is, the more it stands out. This can lead to mistakes in thinking and decision-making. Imagine a person watches news reports about airplane crashes. Even though air travel is one of the safest forms of transportation, the repeated exposure to dramatic footage makes them believe crashes are common. When it's time to book a flight, they hesitate. They remember the terrifying images from television and feel uneasy. In reality, car accidents happen far more often than plane crashes. But because they hear about crashes less frequently, they fear flying more than driving. Another example involves crime rates. If a local news station frequently covers violent crime, people start believing crime is rising, even if statistics show otherwise. The same principle applies to financial markets. If an investor reads a story about a recent stock market drop, they might panic and sell their stocks. They remember the news more vividly than long-term market trends. This short-term thinking can cause them to miss out on gains because they react to what feels important in the moment, rather than looking at historical data. Sports fans often fall into this trap when evaluating athletes. If a basketball player has an outstanding game, people start calling them a star. If they perform poorly, they are suddenly considered overrated. This happens even if their overall performance has been consistent. One standout game or bad performance sticks in people's minds more than the full season statistics. Medical decisions can also be influenced by this kind of bias. A person who hears about a friend's negative reaction to a vaccine may become hesitant, even if the overwhelming data shows the vaccine is safe. The friend's experience is recent and personal, making it feel more significant than scientific evidence. Similarly, if someone starts a new medication and experiences a side effect, they may attribute it to the drug, even if the timing is coincidental. They assume the most recent change caused the effect. Employers can make hiring mistakes when they fall into this pattern of thinking. A job candidate who gives a strong impression in the final interview may be favored over another with a better overall track record. A single interaction overshadows months of performance history. The same happens during performance reviews. A worker who recently made a mistake may receive a poor evaluation, even if they have been reliable throughout the year. The bias is also evident in relationships. If a friend or partner recently did something frustrating, it can color how they are perceived, even if they have been supportive for years. A single argument or disagreement feels like a bigger deal than it actually is because it happened so recently. Advertisers take advantage of this tendency by designing campaigns that stick in people's minds. A catchy commercial or a well-placed ad can make a product seem more relevant than others, even if it's no better than competing options. Political campaigns operate in the same way. A candidate's recent speech or debate performance can dramatically shift public opinion, even if their overall record remains unchanged. This bias is especially strong in moments of stress or pressure. When people are overwhelmed, they rely on whatever information is most accessible. A student who struggles on a test may assume they are bad at the subject, even if they have performed well on previous assignments. A business leader may make a snap decision based on a recent event rather than analyzing long-term data. Breaking free from this way of thinking requires effort. One way to counteract it is to step back and take a broader view. Looking at patterns over time, instead of focusing on recent events, helps create a more balanced perspective. Writing things down can also help. When someone records their thoughts and decisions, they can look back and see if their perceptions match reality. Fact-checking and looking at historical data can also counteract this bias. When people verify their assumptions, they are less likely to fall into the trap of overvaluing the latest information. By recognizing this pattern, people can make better decisions in their personal and professional lives. Whether investing, hiring, managing relationships, or evaluating risks, being aware of how recent events shape perception leads to clearer thinking. Choice supportive bias makes people believe their past choices were better than they actually were. Once someone makes a decision, they tend to remember it in a positive light, even if it wasn't the best option. This happens because people don't like to think they made a mistake. Instead of objectively evaluating past choices, they subconsciously highlight the good aspects and downplay the bad. Imagine someone buys a new car. At the time of purchase, they compare multiple models, look at reviews, and weigh the pros and cons. After making a decision, they begin to recall the car they chose as the best one available. If they come across an article listing its flaws, they dismiss or ignore the information. If a friend points out a competing model with better features, they defend their choice by emphasizing the positives of their own car. Even if they start experiencing minor issues, they justify them as small inconveniences rather than signs that they might have picked the wrong car. This bias appears in many aspects of life, from consumer purchases to relationships and even voting decisions. A person who votes for a political candidate will often defend them later, even when presented with negative information. They convince themselves they made the right decision and may overlook the candidate's mistakes or failings. It's easier to justify a past choice than to admit it might have been a poor one. Relationships show this bias clearly. Someone who chooses a romantic partner might initially notice flaws, but over time starts to focus more on their positive traits. If they break up, they may reframe the relationship as better than it was, remembering the happy moments while ignoring the problems that led to the breakup. On the other hand, if they stay together, they might rationalize their choice by downplaying any issues that arise. This effect can be seen in financial decisions as well. Investors who buy stock in a company may later justify their choice even if the stock underperforms. Instead of admitting they made a mistake, they highlight the company's potential or find external reasons for the stock's failure, such as market downturns or economic conditions. They may hold on to a bad investment longer than they should because acknowledging a poor decision is uncomfortable. Choice supportive bias also affects medical decisions. If a person picks a treatment based on personal research, they may later defend that choice regardless of its effectiveness. Even if they experience side effects or see little improvement, they may insist they made the right decision. This is especially true when they have invested time and effort into their choice. Instead of reconsidering, they focus on any perceived benefits and dismiss negative outcomes. This bias plays a role in hiring decisions too. If a manager chooses a candidate for a job, they are more likely to defend that decision even if the employee underperforms. Instead of admitting they made a hiring mistake, they focus on the employee's strengths and overlook weaknesses. This can lead to keeping the wrong person in a position for too long, causing problems for the team and the company. The same pattern occurs in product loyalty. When people buy a brand repeatedly, they believe it's the best choice, even if competitors offer better alternatives. A coffee drinker who has always bought one brand will often insist it tastes the best, even if a blind taste test proves otherwise. They remember their past choices as superior because it reinforces their sense of good judgment. This bias influences how people recall major life decisions. If someone moves to a new city, they are likely to remember their choice as the best one, even if they struggle with the change. They might emphasize the new opportunities and ignore the downsides. If someone quits a job to start a business, they may recall their decision as brave and visionary, even if the business fails. They focus on what they learned rather than questioning whether they should have taken a different path. Choice supportive bias also affects memories of past purchases. Someone who buys an expensive appliance might later believe it was a smart investment, even if it breaks down frequently. They might recall the positive reviews they read before buying it and forget the negative ones. This helps them feel good about their decision rather than second-guessing it. In group settings, this bias can lead to poor decision-making. If a team chooses a strategy that later proves ineffective, members may still defend it rather than admitting they should have picked another option. They recall the reasoning that led to the decision while downplaying any warning signs they ignored at the time. Choice supportive bias helps people avoid regret, but can also prevent learning from mistakes. If someone refuses to acknowledge a poor decision, they are less likely to improve their decision-making process in the future. Instead of critically evaluating past choices, they continue reinforcing their belief that they always make the right call. This bias connects to self-image. People like to think of themselves as rational and competent. Admitting a past mistake can feel like an attack on their judgment. Instead of accepting that they made an imperfect decision, they reconstruct their memory to fit a more favorable narrative. This makes them feel more confident, but can also trap them in a cycle of repeating the same mistakes. Companies take advantage of this bias in marketing. Brands reinforce a consumer's past choices by using language that validates them. For example, a company might say, "Smart shoppers choose our product," which makes existing customers feel good about their decision. This increases loyalty because customers remember their choice as the best one and resist switching to competitors. This effect extends to education and career choices. Someone who picks a certain college may later believe it was the best possible choice, even if other schools offered better programs. A person who chooses a specific career path might defend it even if they are unhappy, convincing themselves they made the right decision based on past reasoning rather than reassessing their current situation. Choice supportive bias is not about lying to oneself, but about selective memory. People naturally highlight the positives and downplay the negatives of their past decisions. This helps them feel confident, but it also makes them less open to changing their minds when new information arises. Belief bias happens when people judge arguments based on whether they seem true rather than whether they follow logical reasoning. This means they accept statements that fit their beliefs and reject those that don't, even if the reasoning behind them is flawed or strong. People often don't realize they're doing this because their brain naturally looks for patterns and shortcuts to process information quickly. Instead of carefully analyzing an argument, they rely on their gut feeling about whether the conclusion makes sense. Imagine someone who strongly believes in a specific political view. They hear an argument that supports their position, but the logic behind it is weak. Instead of questioning the reasoning, they accept it because the conclusion aligns with what they already think is true. Later, they come across an argument that contradicts their belief, but even if it's well-structured and logically sound, they dismiss it because they don't agree with the conclusion. This happens because of the way the brain processes information. People don't evaluate every piece of information objectively. They filter what they hear based on their existing beliefs. This is why debates on controversial topics often feel frustrating. Each side thinks they are using logic, but in reality, they may just be following what feels true to them. Belief bias affects decision-making in many areas, including health, science, business, and personal relationships. Consider someone who believes that natural remedies are always better than modern medicine. They read a poorly conducted study that claims a particular herb cures a serious illness. Because the conclusion aligns with their belief, they accept it without questioning the study's flaws. Then, they see a well-researched paper proving that modern treatment is more effective, but because it contradicts their views, they assume the study must be biased or manipulated. In a courtroom, belief bias can influence how jurors evaluate evidence. Suppose a defendant looks rough or has a criminal record. Even if the prosecution presents weak evidence, some jurors might assume the person is guilty because it fits their expectations. On the other hand, a well-dressed, well-spoken defendant might receive the benefit of the doubt even if the evidence against them is strong. In both cases, jurors are allowing belief bias to shape their decisions rather than sticking to the logic of the argument presented. People in leadership positions also fall into this trap. A manager might believe that hard work always leads to success. When an employee struggles, the manager assumes they aren't trying hard enough instead of considering other factors like poor training, a toxic work environment, or unrealistic expectations. Because the belief that effort guarantees success is so ingrained, the manager doesn't question whether their assumption is fair. Belief bias is especially common in discussions about new technology. Suppose someone believes artificial intelligence will always be dangerous. When they read an article about AI being used for surveillance, they take it as proof that their belief is correct. But when they see an article about AI helping doctors diagnose diseases faster, they dismiss it as an exception or assume the benefits are exaggerated. In education, belief bias can affect how students learn. A student who believes they are bad at math might ignore evidence of their improvement. If they get a good grade on a test, they assume it was luck or an easy exam, rather than a sign they are getting better. This mindset prevents them from recognizing their own growth and keeps them from building confidence in the subject. Even experts are not immune to belief bias. Scientists, doctors, and researchers rely on data and analysis, but their beliefs can still influence how they interpret results. A researcher who expects a particular outcome may unconsciously favor data that supports their hypothesis and overlook data that contradicts it. That's why peer review and replication studies are important. They help catch these biases and ensure conclusions are based on solid evidence. Belief bias becomes even stronger when emotions are involved. When people feel strongly about a topic, they have a harder time separating logic from emotion. This is why arguments about religion, politics, and ethics often become heated. Each side believes they are being logical, but in reality, their emotions shape how they evaluate the arguments. Marketing and media take advantage of belief bias to influence opinions. Advertisers know that people trust information that aligns with their existing views. A company selling organic food will emphasize studies that support the benefits of organic produce, while downplaying or ignoring research that challenges those claims. News outlets sometimes do the same thing, highlighting stories that fit their audience's beliefs while ignoring or downplaying opposing viewpoints. One way to counter belief bias is to practice critical thinking. This means stepping back and asking, is the reasoning sound, or do I just like the conclusion? It helps to look for evidence that contradicts your beliefs instead of just seeking confirmation. Asking, what would change my mind, is a useful way to test whether you are being objective. Another strategy is to slow down when evaluating arguments. When people make quick decisions, they rely more on intuition and less on logical analysis. Taking time to consider the structure of an argument rather than just the conclusion can help reduce belief bias. Engaging with a variety of perspectives also helps. When people expose themselves to different viewpoints, they become better at recognizing their own biases. This doesn't mean agreeing with everything, but it does mean listening carefully and evaluating arguments based on their merit rather than personal beliefs. Belief bias is a natural part of how the brain works, but recognizing it can lead to better decisions. Whether in everyday conversations, business strategies, or major policy decisions, being aware of this bias helps people think more clearly and make choices based on reason rather than assumption. The false consensus effect is a cognitive bias where people believe that their opinions, beliefs, and behaviors are more widely shared than they actually are. When someone assumes that most people think the way they do, they may ignore or downplay evidence that suggests otherwise. This bias can shape decisions, influence social interactions, and even impact how people perceive themselves and others. Imagine a person who strongly supports a particular political policy. They assume that most reasonable and well-informed people share their view. When they meet someone who disagrees, they may think of them as misinformed or part of a small, extreme minority. In reality, opinions on most political issues are diverse, and people arrive at their beliefs through different life experiences, values, and reasoning. But because of the false consensus effect, this person overestimates how common their perspective is. leading to a skewed understanding of public opinion. This bias often appears in everyday social situations. A manager might believe that their employees agree with a new company policy simply because they support it. They might assume that everyone sees the benefits clearly and fail to consider opposing perspectives. When employees push back or express concerns, the manager may feel surprised or even frustrated, assuming that only a few people hold these objections. By misjudging how widely their view is shared, the manager risks making decisions that don't align with the needs of the group. Another common example involves lifestyle choices. A person who follows a strict diet might assume that most people understand and accept their dietary preferences. They might believe that avoiding certain foods is the obvious and logical choice, leading them to be confused or even judgmental when they encounter people who eat differently. This can create tension in social settings, as they struggle to accept that their choices are not as universally valued as they assumed. This bias can also show up in simple, everyday interactions. Someone who enjoys a particular movie might assume that everyone else either loves it or is wrong. If they bring it up in conversation and someone responds with indifference, they might react with shock or disbelief. They may even try to convince the other person that they must not have truly understood the film. The assumption that their taste represents a larger consensus prevents them from seeing the diversity of opinions that exist. One reason this bias exists is that people tend to surround themselves with like-minded individuals. If someone spends most of their time with people who share their interests, values, and beliefs, they naturally assume that those views are widespread. Social circles often reinforce personal opinions, making them feel like the norm rather than just one perspective among many. This effect is even stronger in the age of social media, where algorithms curate content based on past behavior, creating an illusion that everyone thinks the same way. Another factor is the human tendency to view personal opinions as rational and well-founded. Most people believe they reach conclusions through logical reasoning. If they see their beliefs as the result of careful thought, it's easy to assume that others, given the same information, would reach the same conclusion. This makes it difficult to recognize that people approach issues from different backgrounds, experiences, and mental frameworks. The false consensus effect can also lead to poor decision-making in groups. If a team leader assumes that everyone supports a project because they personally believe in it, they may fail to gather input from others. This can result in overlooking concerns, ignoring risks, or missing opportunities for improvement. Without realizing it, the leader may silence dissenting opinions, creating an environment where people hesitate to speak up. This can lead to flawed strategies, wasted resources, or failed initiatives. Marketing and advertising professionals must be mindful of this bias when trying to understand their target audience. If a company assumes that most consumers share their taste or values, they may develop campaigns that fail to resonate with a broader audience. A marketing team that loves high-tech gadgets might assume that the average person values the same features they do, leading them to promote complex specifications instead of focusing on practical benefits. If they misjudge what their customers care about, they risk losing sales and alienating potential buyers. The false consensus effect can also play a role in conflicts and misunderstandings. When people assume their views are the majority, they may dismiss opposing perspectives too quickly. This can lead to frustration in debates, where both sides believe they hold the popular opinion and see the other as an outlier. Instead of engaging in meaningful discussion, they might resort to dismissive or defensive behavior, making it harder to find common ground. This bias can also make it difficult for people to recognize their own biases. If someone assumes their beliefs are widely accepted, they may not question them as critically as they should. They might resist new information that challenges their assumptions, believing that any alternative view is fringe or incorrect. This can limit personal growth and prevent people from considering different ways of thinking. In the workplace, the false consensus effect can affect hiring and team dynamics. A hiring manager who assumes that most people value the same work style they do may unintentionally favor candidates who think like them. they might overlook the benefits of diverse perspectives and end up building a team with limited viewpoints. This can reduce creativity, innovation, and problem-solving ability, as everyone approaches challenges in a similar way. This bias also affects how people evaluate their own behavior. Someone who frequently arrives late to meetings might assume that most people do the same, leading them to dismiss any concerns about punctuality. They might feel unfairly criticized when colleagues bring it up, believing that their behavior is more normal than it actually is. This can create tension in professional and personal relationships, as they fail to see how their actions differ from the expectations of others. People can reduce the false consensus effect by actively seeking out diverse perspectives. Engaging with individuals from different backgrounds, listening to opposing viewpoints, and questioning personal assumptions can help create a more accurate understanding of how common or uncommon certain beliefs actually are. Asking open-ended questions and encouraging honest feedback can also help prevent this bias from distorting decision-making. It also helps to recognize that most issues are more complex than they seem. Just because something feels obvious to one person doesn't mean it is obvious to everyone. Understanding that people interpret information through different lenses can make it easier to appreciate varying perspectives. Instead of assuming agreement, people can learn to ask others what they think and be open to unexpected responses. This bias isn't just about opinions and beliefs. It can also affect memory. People tend to remember situations in ways that reinforce their assumptions. If someone believes that most people agree with them, they may selectively recall instances that support this view while forgetting or downplaying moments of disagreement. This makes the bias even harder to recognize, as it feels backed by experience rather than assumption. Being aware of the false consensus effect can help people navigate social interactions, make better decisions, and foster more meaningful conversations. By acknowledging that personal beliefs are not universal, individuals can improve their ability to understand, empathize, and collaborate with others. Recognizing this bias can also lead to more accurate judgments and prevent misunderstandings that arise from overestimating shared perspectives. People often see connections where none exist. This happens because the human brain looks for patterns to make sense of the world. One example of this is the illusory correlation. It occurs when people believe two things are related even though they are not. This can lead to false assumptions, stereotypes, and poor decision-making. A common example involves superstitions. Someone might think that wearing a lucky shirt causes their favorite sports team to win. The truth is, the team's performance has nothing to do with the shirt. The person connects these two things because they have seen the pattern before. If they wear the shirt and the team wins, they remember it. If they wear it and the team loses, they dismiss it as an exception. This selective memory strengthens the false belief. Another example appears in everyday life. A person may believe that every time they wash their car, it rains. They notice when it happens, but they do not pay attention to all the times it does not. The mind makes a connection that is not real. This leads to the belief that washing the car somehow influences the weather. The pattern is imaginary, but the brain convinces them it exists. Stereotypes come from this same mental error. If someone meets a few rude people from a certain city, they might assume that everyone from that city is rude. They remember the negative experiences and ignore all the positive ones. Over time, this false connection becomes a strong belief. It is not based on reality, but on selective memory and perception. Illusory correlation also appears in medicine. People might believe that a certain food causes an illness because they ate it once and then got sick. They do not consider other possible causes, like a virus or something else they ate. The food stands out in their memory, making them believe it was the cause. Even if they eat the same food later without getting sick, the first experience stays stronger in their mind. This can lead to unnecessary fear and avoidance. The same problem occurs in finance. Investors may believe that a stock always goes up after they buy it, but this is not true. They remember the times they made money and forget the times they lost. This creates a false sense of control. They believe their actions influence the market when, in reality, the market moves independently. This illusion can lead to risky decisions and financial loss. Crime statistics can also be misleading because of illusory correlation. If a person hears about a crime committed by a particular group, they might assume that the whole group is more likely to commit crimes. This belief forms because they notice when a crime fits their assumption, but they do not notice when it contradicts it. The media often reinforces this by covering certain crimes more than others. The pattern appears real, but it is just a trick of perception. Sports fans often fall into this trap as well. A baseball player might believe that wearing a certain pair of socks improves their performance. If they have a good game while wearing them, they remember it. If they play poorly, they dismiss it as bad luck. This selective thinking creates a false connection between the socks and performance. It is not the socks making them play well, it is their skill and preparation. This bias affects relationships too. A person might think that every time they argue with their partner, it is on a Monday. If they believe Mondays are bad luck for their relationship, they will focus on those days when conflicts happen. They will ignore all the arguments that happen on other days. This can create unnecessary tension and strain the relationship. Illusory correlation also plays a role in hiring decisions. A manager might believe that employees from a certain school perform better than others. If they hire someone from that school who does well, they remember it. If another employee from the same school performs poorly, they dismiss it as an exception. Over time, this belief influences hiring choices, even if the data does not support it. The same thinking appears in health trends. People often believe that certain diets or supplements have effects that are not scientifically proven. If they take a supplement and feel more energetic, they assume it is the cause. They do not consider other factors like sleep, exercise, or diet. This leads to a strong belief in the supplement's power, even if there is no real effect. Illusory correlation affects gambling behavior too. A person might think that rolling the dice a certain way increases their chances of winning. They remember the times it worked and forget the times it did not. This creates the false belief that they have control over a random event. The reality is that each roll is independent, but their mind convinces them otherwise. The illusion even influences political opinions. Someone might believe that every time a certain party is in power, the economy improves. They notice when this happens and ignore the times when it does not. This makes them believe there is a direct connection, even when many other factors influence the economy. Social media amplifies this problem. People see posts that confirm their beliefs and assume they represent reality. If someone believes that a certain type of person is always rude, they will notice stories that support this idea. The algorithm reinforces this by showing similar content. Over time, the false connection strengthens, making it harder to see the truth. Illusory correlation also influences parenting. A parent might believe that every time their child eats sugar, they become hyperactive. They notice when their child is energetic after eating sweets, but they ignore when their child is calm after eating them. Research shows that sugar does not cause hyperactivity, but the belief persists because of selective attention. This bias even appears in history. People remember events that support a certain narrative and forget the ones that contradict it. This shapes collective memory and influences how societies interpret their past. The connections people make are not always based on fact, but on what stands out the most. The illusion affects legal decisions as well. A jury member might believe that people who dress a certain way are more likely to commit crimes. If they see a defendant who fits that image, they assume guilt more easily. This leads to unfair judgments based on appearance rather than evidence. Even advertising takes advantage of this. If a person sees multiple ads linking a product to happiness, they begin to believe it. They make the connection even if the product has nothing to do with happiness. This is why brands use emotional associations in their marketing. These false connections happen because the brain wants to simplify information. It is easier to see patterns than to analyze every detail. This is why people make quick assumptions instead of looking at all the evidence. The problem is that these assumptions can lead to mistakes, poor decisions, and unfair judgments. Understanding this bias can help people think more clearly. It allows them to question assumptions, look at real data, and avoid falling for false patterns. The brain will always try to make connections, but being aware of this tendency makes it easier to recognize when it happens. The base rate fallacy happens when people ignore general statistical facts in favor of specific details that feel more relevant or convincing. This error in thinking leads to poor decision-making because it puts too much weight on isolated examples and not enough on broad data. People tend to trust personal stories, vivid details, or rare events over statistical probabilities, even when the numbers provide a clearer picture. This happens in everyday life, from medical diagnoses to court cases, financial decisions, and even sports predictions. Imagine a doctor is diagnosing a rare disease that affects 1 in 10,000 people. A test for the disease is 99% accurate, meaning it correctly identifies someone with the disease 99% of the time and falsely identifies a healthy person 1% of the time. A patient takes the test, and it comes back positive. Many people assume the patient almost certainly has the disease. That seems logical because the test is highly accurate. However, that assumption ignores the base rate, the actual prevalence of the disease in the population. To understand the mistake, consider how many false positives exist. If 1 in 10,000 people truly has the disease and we test 1 million people, only about 100 will have it. But because the test has a 1% false positive rate, it will wrongly label 9 to 999 healthy people as positive. That means there are about 10,099 total positive tests, but only 100 of them are real cases. The probability that someone who tested positive actually has the disease is much lower than expected, only about 1%. The base rate fallacy leads people to think the test result is nearly certain when, in reality, it's mostly false alarms. The fallacy appears in legal settings as well. Suppose a fingerprint found at a crime scene matches a suspect, and an expert states that the probability of this happening by chance is 1 in 1 million. A prosecutor might argue that this means the suspect is almost certainly guilty. That logic seems strong until you consider the base rate. If the fingerprint database has 10 million people, then even with a 1 in 1 million error rate, about 10 innocent people could match the print by pure chance. Ignoring the base rate makes the evidence seem stronger than it really is. In finance, people fall for this error when evaluating investments. Suppose a stock analyst predicts a market crash, and it happens. He seems brilliant, but if there are 1,000 analysts making different predictions, one of them is bound to be right by chance. If that analyst made the same prediction every year, he would eventually get it right. Many people ignore the base rate, how often such predictions are wrong, and instead focus on the one lucky guess, assuming skill where there is only randomness. Gambling provides another example. Imagine someone wins a big lottery jackpot and says they had a lucky feeling about their numbers. People hear that story and might think intuition plays a role in picking winning numbers. But they ignore the base rate, the millions of people who also had lucky feelings and lost. The rare winner stands out, while the vast majority of losers remain unnoticed. The fallacy affects hiring decisions as well. A company might interview a candidate with an unusual background and wonder if they should take a chance on them. They focus on a story of someone similar who succeeded in the past, but forget to consider the overall success rate of such hires. If most employees with that background fail, then making a decision based on one success story is a mistake. The base rate, the general trend, matters more than a single example. Marketing often exploits this fallacy. A supplement company might show a dramatic weight loss story, implying that their product caused the transformation. The ad ignores the base rate of all users, most of whom likely saw little to no effect. The single case is emotionally compelling, but it doesn't reflect the actual probability of success. Crime reporting also plays a role. If the news highlights a shocking crime in a normally safe area, people overestimate their risk. A single violent event stands out in memory, even if statistics show crime rates are low. The base rate fallacy causes unnecessary fear and leads to irrational decisions, such as avoiding safe neighborhoods or making drastic security upgrades that provide little real benefit. The same thinking error appears in sports. A team might win several games in a row, and fans assume they are on a hot streak. But if they won by small margins against weaker opponents, the base rate suggests they are not as strong as their record suggests. People ignore long-term performance trends in favor of recent results, leading to overconfidence in predictions. Even in relationships, the fallacy plays a role. Someone might believe they will never get divorced because they know a couple who has been happily married for 50 years. That single example feels powerful, but it ignores the base rate of divorces across many relationships. Believing personal experience is more meaningful than broad data leads to misjudging risks and outcomes. This error in thinking also affects political views. A voter might see one government policy work well in a specific case and assume it will succeed everywhere. They ignore the overall success rate of similar policies in different contexts. Focusing on one example while disregarding broader data leads to flawed beliefs. One reason people fall for this bias is that personal stories feel more real than abstract numbers. A vivid example sticks in memory, while statistics seem cold and impersonal. The human mind is wired to respond to narratives, which makes it easy to ignore base rates in favor of compelling anecdotes. Another factor is that probabilities are not intuitive. People struggle to grasp how large numbers interact, leading to errors in judgment. Even when presented with statistical data, many prefer to rely on gut feelings or isolated cases. The best way to avoid this bias is to always ask about the base rate. Before making a judgment, consider the overall probabilities instead of focusing on a single case. If a test result suggests a rare condition, check how often false positives occur. If a crime seems shocking, look at the general crime rate. If an investment looks promising because one person got rich, examine how often others failed. Being aware of the base rate fallacy improves decision-making in every area of life. It helps people see past emotional reactions and think critically about probabilities. When making choices, looking at the big picture is more reliable than getting caught up in isolated details. The planning fallacy happens when people underestimate how much time, effort, or resources a task will take. This bias makes individuals, teams, and even large organizations believe they can complete a project faster or with fewer obstacles than reality allows. It affects everything from personal projects to government infrastructure. It often leads to delays, budget overruns, and frustration. Imagine someone planning to renovate their kitchen. They estimate it will take 2 weeks. They assume contractors will arrive on time, materials will be available, and there won't be any surprises. They don't account for delays in permits, back-ordered tiles, or unexpected plumbing issues. The 2-week job turns into 2 months, costing twice as much. This is the planning fallacy in action. People fall into this trap because they rely too much on best-case scenarios. They assume everything will go as planned and don't factor in the likelihood of setbacks. This happens even when they have past experience with similar delays. Someone who has struggled with late projects before might still believe, this time will be different. They forget the lessons from previous experiences or assume they've learned enough to avoid past mistakes. Psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky first identified this bias in 1979. They found that when people estimate time or costs, they focus too much on what they want to happen rather than what is likely. They don't look at similar past projects to get a realistic sense of time. Instead, they rely on intuition, which tends to be overly optimistic. A college student writing a research paper may think they can finish in one night. They imagine themselves working efficiently, finding sources quickly, and avoiding distractions. They don't think about how long research takes, the time needed for editing, or unexpected interruptions. They start late, then scramble to finish, often producing lower quality work. If they had planned based on past experiences, they might have started earlier and allocated more time. Organizations also fall victim to the planning fallacy. Large-scale projects like public transit systems, bridges, and office buildings often take years longer than expected and go millions or billions over budget. Boston's Big Dig highway project was supposed to cost $2.6 billion and finish in 7 years. Instead, it took over 2 decades and cost $14.6 billion. Those planning the project didn't account for design flaws, contractor disputes, and unforeseen geological issues. Technology projects are especially prone to this bias. Software developers often assume coding will be straightforward, but unexpected bugs, security flaws, and integration issues add time. The healthcare.gov website, meant to provide Americans with an easy way to sign up for health insurance, was supposed to launch smoothly. Instead, it crashed under user demand, had major technical issues, and required months of fixes. Planners assumed everything would work as expected, instead of preparing for realistic problems. One reason people underestimate time and costs is that they focus on internal factors instead of external realities. They consider their own ability to work quickly, but ignore how others will slow things down. A writer may think they can finish a novel draft in 3 months, but they don't account for slow feedback from editors, delays in research, or the time needed to revise. Group projects amplify the problem. Each member may believe they can finish their part on time, but they don't account for miscommunication, differing work speeds, or dependency on others. A marketing team launching a new product may set a tight deadline based on each person's best-case scenario. But delays in approvals, supplier issues, or unexpected revisions push the launch back. Memory plays a role in the planning fallacy. People tend to recall past successes more than past failures. Even if a project took twice as long before, they assume it was an anomaly. They believe they've improved and will do better next time. But without adjusting their process or planning differently, they make the same mistakes again. A freelance graphic designer might estimate that a client logo will take 2 days. They don't consider that the client might request multiple revisions, struggle to provide clear feedback, or take days to respond. If they had looked at past projects, they would see that most logo designs take at least a week due to back-and-forth adjustments. One way to counteract this bias is to use reference class forecasting. This means looking at similar past projects to get a more accurate estimate rather than relying on gut feelings. A software engineer working on a new app feature should check how long similar features took in the past. If they usually take 3 weeks, but the engineer assumes they can finish in 1, they should adjust their estimate. Breaking a project into smaller parts also helps. Instead of estimating the total time at once, people can predict how long each step will take and add buffer time for delays. A wedding planner might assume organizing a wedding will take 6 months, but underestimate the time needed for vendor selection, dress fittings, and catering decisions. If they look at each part separately, they get a more accurate timeline. Having an outside perspective reduces optimism bias. When people estimate their own projects, they assume they will work at peak efficiency. But when they estimate how long someone else will take, they are more realistic. A teacher grading papers may assume they can finish in 2 hours, but if they estimate how long a colleague would take, they might say 4 hours. Applying this perspective to their own work helps them be more accurate. Deadlines should also include contingency time. Adding 20 to 50% more time than initially estimated allows room for unexpected problems. If a team thinks they can complete a report in 5 days, setting the deadline for 7 days reduces stress and increases the chance of delivering quality work. Organizations that use historical data avoid common mistakes. Construction firms that track project timelines can adjust future estimates based on real patterns. If apartment buildings usually take 8 months instead of 6, setting realistic deadlines prevents cost overruns and customer disappointment. The planning fallacy isn't just about time. It also affects money and resources. People underestimate costs, assuming they will stick to a budget. A homeowner renovating their bathroom may set a budget of $5,000, thinking materials and labor will stay within limits. They don't anticipate unexpected plumbing repairs or price increases. Business leaders launching new products often assume marketing costs will be lower than they are. They expect customers to adopt their product quickly, but fail to budget for extended campaigns, customer support, and unforeseen distribution issues. The same bias appears in personal finance. People setting financial goals assume they will save a certain amount each month, but don't account for unexpected expenses. Someone planning to save for a vacation in 6 months might assume they can set aside $500 per month, but if they face car repairs or medical bills, they fall short. Correcting for the planning fallacy leads to better decisions. Using past data, Adjusting for realistic setbacks and adding buffer time reduces stress and improves outcomes. Instead of assuming everything will go smoothly, preparing for obstacles leads to more reliable results. Status quo bias happens when people prefer things to stay the same, even when change might be better. This bias makes individuals resist new options, even if they are more beneficial, because the familiar feels safer. People feel comfort in what they know and often assume that change will lead to loss, inconvenience, or regret. This happens in everyday decisions, business choices, and even major life events. Imagine someone who has been using the same phone model for 5 years. A newer version offers better battery life, a sharper camera, and faster performance. The person acknowledges these improvements, but sticks with their old device because they fear they might not like the new design or settings. They tell themselves, "This phone still works fine," even though they often complain about its slow speed. The effort of learning a new system seems like a hassle, so they avoid upgrading. Status quo bias is common in financial decisions. Many employees sign up for a retirement plan when they start a job and never adjust it, even when their income changes. They may miss out on better investment opportunities because reviewing their portfolio feels overwhelming. Even when a company offers better options, people hesitate to make changes. They think, "What if I choose the wrong option?" This fear of making a bad decision keeps them locked into suboptimal choices. Healthcare decisions also show this bias. Patients sometimes stick with a treatment plan even when a better alternative becomes available. A person taking medication for years may resist switching to a newer drug with fewer side effects. They trust what they already use, even if the new option has been proven to work better. This mindset extends to lifestyle habits. Someone who has always eaten a certain way may ignore healthier diets because they feel comfortable with their routine. Businesses face status quo bias when making changes. A company might use outdated software because employees feel comfortable with it. Even when a new system promises efficiency, the transition seems daunting. Management worries that employees will resist, so they avoid upgrading. This keeps companies stuck in old habits, making them less competitive over time. This bias also affects politics and policies. Voters often support existing laws or leaders because change feels risky. Even when reforms promise improvements, people worry about unintended consequences. Governments sometimes struggle to implement beneficial changes because the public fears the unknown. One key reason people resist change is loss aversion. Studies show that people feel losses more strongly than gains. If a decision has even a small chance of leading to a negative outcome, they might avoid it altogether. Even when potential benefits outweigh risks, the fear of losing what they already have keeps them from acting. Familiarity plays a role too. People trust what they know. If something has worked for years, they assume it will continue to work. They may even justify inefficiencies by downplaying problems. This process has always worked for us becomes an excuse for avoiding improvement. Decision paralysis is another factor. When people face too many choices, they often default to the familiar. Choosing a new option requires effort, research, and weighing pros and cons. Instead of putting in the effort, they stick with what they have. Marketing and sales strategies take advantage of status quo bias. Companies know that getting customers to switch brands is difficult. That's why businesses offer free trials, discounts, or limited time offers to break the attachment to familiar products. Subscription services rely on the idea that once people sign up, they will hesitate to cancel even if they no longer use the service. This bias also affects social behavior. People tend to stick with the same routines, friend groups, and daily habits. Even when they feel unhappy, making a change seems harder than staying put. Someone might stay in a job they dislike for years because finding a new one feels uncertain. They tell themselves, "At least I know what to expect here." Understanding status quo bias helps people recognize when they are avoiding change for no good reason. Instead of assuming the current choice is best, they can ask themselves, "Am I choosing this because it's truly better or because it's familiar?" By evaluating decisions more critically, people can make choices that improve their lives. Zero-risk bias makes people choose options that remove all risk, even when better choices exist. The mind prefers certainty over uncertainty, even if eliminating risk isn't the smartest decision. This happens in everyday life, from financial decisions to health choices. People want to feel safe, so they favor solutions that seem to offer complete security, even if those solutions come with hidden downsides. A simple example is a homeowner who wants to improve their property's safety. They have a budget to upgrade their security system and fix structural issues in their house. One option is to install a top-tier security system, making burglary almost impossible. The other option is to split the budget between a decent security system and fixing a weak foundation. The second choice reduces both security and structural risks, but doesn't fully eliminate either. The first option completely removes the fear of burglary, but ignores the foundation problem, which could be a bigger long-term threat. The homeowner picks the security system because it feels like a total solution, even though fixing the foundation might be the smarter move. The desire to eliminate one risk overshadows the need to manage multiple risks wisely. In business, zero-risk bias shows up in investment decisions. A company choosing between two projects might favor one that has a guaranteed but small return over another with a higher potential profit but some level of uncertainty. Instead of taking a calculated risk that could yield greater rewards, they pick the safer but less profitable option. This bias can limit growth and lead to missed opportunities. Companies that always pick the safest choice may fall behind competitors willing to take on manageable risks. A common example in personal finance is paying off a small debt with zero interest instead of investing money where it could grow. Suppose someone has a $5,000 loan with no interest and an extra $5,000 in savings. They could pay off the loan and feel like they've removed financial risk, but keeping the money in a high-yield investment would likely generate more wealth over time. The loan isn't costing them anything, yet zero-risk bias makes them prioritize eliminating debt completely because it feels like a safer choice. Health decisions also show this pattern. Imagine a person who is afraid of getting the flu. They obsessively sanitize their hands, avoid public places, and refuse to meet friends during flu season. These behaviors lower their risk of catching the flu to almost zero, but they come at the cost of social isolation and mental well-being. A better approach might be getting a flu shot, practicing good hygiene, and maintaining a balanced lifestyle. The need to completely eliminate risk pushes them to extreme behavior, which might cause more harm than good. Government policies also reflect zero-risk bias. When a city faces traffic accidents at a busy intersection, officials might choose a costly solution like removing all traffic lights and replacing them with an overpass, eliminating the risk of collisions at that spot. A cheaper and more effective solution could be adjusting traffic light timing, adding warning signs, or increasing police presence. The overpass feels like a perfect fix, but it might not be the best use of resources. The bias toward removing all risk leads to costly decisions that aren't always the most efficient. Even in everyday shopping, this bias influences choices. A person shopping for a car might pick a model with the best safety ratings, even if it lacks fuel efficiency and is outside their budget. The car with slightly lower safety ratings might still be very safe and offer better value overall, but the need to remove all perceived risk takes priority. Zero-risk bias often plays a role in relationships as well. Someone who has been hurt in the past may avoid new relationships altogether to protect themselves from emotional pain. Instead of taking a balanced approach by getting to know people slowly and setting healthy boundaries, they cut themselves off entirely. This removes the immediate risk of heartbreak, but also eliminates the possibility of meaningful connections. People also display this bias in how they manage time. Someone with a big project might spend an excessive amount of time planning to avoid mistakes. They revise their plan repeatedly instead of starting the work. The extra planning removes uncertainty, but it delays progress. A better approach would be to start working and adjust as needed, but the pull of eliminating all risk keeps them stuck in preparation mode. Zero-risk bias is deeply tied to human psychology. The brain craves certainty because uncertainty triggers stress. In ancient times, survival often depended on avoiding risks entirely, not managing them. If a hunter saw a dangerous animal, Running away was the safest choice. There was no room for strategic thinking about whether the animal might not attack. This instinct remains even when the risks we face today are more complex and often require nuanced decisions. Marketing often exploits this bias. Companies frame their products as eliminating all risks rather than managing them. A skincare brand might promise 100% acne-free skin instead of saying their product significantly reduces breakouts. A financial service might market an investment plan as guaranteed protection against loss rather than explaining how risk can be managed for better returns. These messages appeal to the natural human desire for complete security, even if the reality is more complex. The way to counter zero-risk bias is to recognize when it's happening and reframe decisions. Instead of asking, how do I eliminate all risk? A better question is, how do I manage risk effectively? This shift allows for better decision-making by considering trade-offs. Accepting that some level of uncertainty is part of every choice leads to smarter and more balanced decisions. For example, instead of choosing a job based only on job security, someone might also consider growth potential and job satisfaction. Instead of putting all their money into a savings account to avoid market risks, they might invest a portion to balance safety and growth. Instead of avoiding all public speaking opportunities to prevent embarrassment, they might start with smaller engagements to build confidence gradually. Understanding zero-risk bias helps in making better choices in all areas of life. By recognizing when the urge to eliminate risk is taking over, people can step back and evaluate whether they are actually making the best choice or just seeking the illusion of complete safety. Reactance happens when people push back against rules or suggestions because they feel their freedom is being taken away. This reaction is common in everyday life. When someone feels pressured, they may do the opposite of what they are told just to reassert control. This is not always a conscious decision. It often comes from an instinctive need to protect personal choice. Imagine a workplace where management announces a strict new dress code. Employees who never had an issue with their attire before suddenly feel restricted. Some may start bending the rules by wearing slightly off-code outfits or even ignoring the policy altogether. The change in behavior isn't necessarily about the dress code itself. It's about the feeling that their personal choices have been limited without their input. Even if the dress code is reasonable, the way it is enforced can trigger resistance. Reactance can also show up in relationships. If a friend constantly tells someone what to do, even with good intentions, the person on the receiving end may start resisting their advice. A mother who keeps reminding her child to eat vegetables may notice that the child avoids them even more. The issue isn't always about the vegetables, but about the child feeling controlled. The same dynamic can happen in adult relationships. If a partner insists on certain behaviors, the other person may start doing the opposite just to feel independent. Marketing and advertising often trigger reactance. When companies use phrases like, "act now before it's too late," some people feel pressured and decide not to buy at all. They don't like being told what to do, even if the product is good. On the other hand, when companies give consumers a sense of choice, like, "you decide when you're ready," people are more likely to engage. The difference is in how much control they feel over their decision. Government rules and public health campaigns can also trigger reactance. During a health crisis, officials may tell people to stay indoors or wear masks. While some comply, others resist, not necessarily because they think the rules are wrong, but because they don't like being told what to do. They may see the rules as an attack on personal freedom rather than a public safety measure. This can make enforcement tricky. If officials present restrictions as guidelines instead of demands, they may face less pushback. Reactance is a key reason why warning labels on products sometimes backfire. If a sign on a cigarette pack says, "you must stop smoking now," smokers may feel more determined to continue. They may see the message as an attack on their autonomy. But if the label simply provides facts, like smoking increases the risk of lung disease, people might be more open to considering a change. Social media makes reactance even stronger. When people see posts telling them what to think or do, they often dig in their heels. If someone aggressively promotes a political view, Others may resist just because they don't like the feeling of being told what to believe. This happens regardless of the topic. It's not just about the content, it's about how the message is delivered. In education, reactance can affect learning. When students feel forced to study a subject, they may resist, even if they would have enjoyed it otherwise. A student who loves reading might lose interest if a teacher assigns too many books with strict deadlines. The enjoyment turns into an obligation, and the student pushes back. Teachers who give students some choice in assignments often get better engagement. When students feel they have control, they are more willing to participate. Parents deal with reactance all the time. A teenager who is told they can't go out may suddenly feel an overwhelming urge to do exactly that. The more strict the rule, the more intense the pushback. But if parents present the rule as a discussion rather than a command, they might reduce resistance. Saying, "I'd feel better if you stayed home tonight because of the weather," gives the teenager room to agree instead of feeling forced. Reactance also appears in customer service situations. If a customer asks for a refund and is immediately told no refunds allowed, they may become more upset. They might argue harder, leave a bad review, or even vow never to shop there again. But if the company explains the policy in a way that acknowledges the customer's feelings, "I understand why you'd want a refund. Let me see what options we have," the customer may feel less resistance. Reactance is not always bad. It can be a sign of independent thinking. When people challenge authority, they sometimes expose unfair rules. A workplace that punishes employees for taking breaks might face pushback that leads to better policies. If people never resisted rules, bad decisions might go unchallenged. However, reactance can also lead to poor choices, like ignoring good advice just because it feels controlling. People can reduce reactance in themselves by recognizing when it happens. If a rule or suggestion makes them feel rebellious, they can pause and ask whether the rule itself is the problem or just the way it was presented. When someone feels defensive about advice, they might consider whether their reaction is about autonomy rather than the content of the advice. On the other side, those who want to avoid triggering reactance in others can focus on presenting choices rather than issuing commands. Instead of saying, "You have to do this," they can say, "Here are some options." Instead of banning something outright, they can explain the reasons behind a decision and allow room for discussion. Even small changes in wording can make a big difference in how people respond. Reactance shapes how people interact with authority, advertising, relationships, and even their own decisions. It's a natural reaction, but understanding it can help people navigate situations more smoothly. When people feel they have control over their choices, they are more likely to make decisions that align with their own best interests. People see patterns where none exist. The clustering illusion is a common mistake in thinking that happens when someone believes random events form a meaningful pattern. The human brain looks for order, even when randomness is at play. This instinct helps in survival, but it also leads to errors in judgment. Imagine someone flipping a coin 10 times. If the first 5 flips land on heads, they may think the coin is unfair or biased. But the odds of getting 5 heads in a row are not as rare as they seem. The coin does not remember past flips. Each flip remains a 50-50 chance. The belief that the streak means something is an example of the clustering illusion. People often see patterns in gambling. A roulette player notices that the ball has landed on red 5 times in a row. They assume black is due to come next. This is the gambler's fallacy, which stems from the clustering illusion. In reality, each spin is independent. The previous outcomes have no effect on the next one. The brain, however, looks for trends and assumes they must mean something. Casinos make money from this mistake. This bias appears in sports too. A basketball player makes 3 shots in a row. Fans believe the player is on a hot streak and expect the next shot to go in. But statistical studies show that shooting streaks happen by chance. A player's past success does not predict the next shot. The belief in hot hands comes from seeing patterns that are not real. The clustering illusion affects people in financial decisions. Investors look at stock charts and see trends. If a stock rises several days in a row, they assume it will keep going up. If it drops, they think it will continue to fall. They believe past movements predict future performance. But stock prices move due to many factors, often randomly. Short-term patterns do not guarantee future trends. Yet many traders base decisions on perceived streaks, leading to costly mistakes. Crime reports often trigger the clustering illusion. A neighborhood experiences a few burglaries in a short time. Residents believe crime is rising, even if overall rates have not changed. The pattern looks meaningful, but the clustering illusion distorts perception. Police data often shows that crime occurs in clusters due to chance. The sudden rise does not always indicate a long-term problem. Still, people feel uneasy and push for new policies based on what they see as a trend. Conspiracy theories often arise from this bias. People connect unrelated events and believe they reveal hidden truths. They notice patterns in news reports, symbols, or numbers. A common example is the belief in secret messages in historical events. The human mind links coincidences, creating the illusion of intent. This fuels misinformation and paranoia. Those affected by the clustering illusion struggle to accept that randomness plays a larger role in life than they assume. Medical science faces issues due to this bias. A patient takes a new supplement and later feels better. They believe the supplement caused the improvement, but their health may have improved naturally. People often notice short-term changes and assume cause and effect. Doctors rely on large studies to determine real patterns. Without careful analysis, random fluctuations can mislead patients and researchers alike. Weather predictions also fall victim to this illusion. Someone notices that storms seem to happen more on weekends. They believe this pattern is real and blame pollution, government interference, or bad luck. But looking at long-term records often shows no real connection. The clustering illusion makes the random distribution of storms appear intentional. The bias affects decision-making in everyday life. A person driving through town notices 3 red cars in a row. They assume red cars are more common than they actually are. Another person hears about 3 celebrity deaths in a week and believes famous people always die in groups. The mind seeks order, even when none exists. The clustering illusion even impacts security measures. A company experiences a few cyber attacks in 1 month. Executives panic and assume hackers are targeting them. In reality, attacks may occur at a steady rate, and the recent clustering is coincidence. But fear leads to rushed security decisions that may not be necessary. Understanding randomness helps prevent overreaction. Superstitions come from the clustering illusion too. A baseball player wears the same socks after winning a game, believing they bring luck. A student sits in the same chair for every exam, thinking it improves their performance. These beliefs form because the mind links unrelated events. The pattern seems real, even when logic says otherwise. The clustering illusion explains why people see faces in clouds or hear messages in static noise. The brain evolved to detect patterns for survival. Early humans needed to spot predators and find food. But in modern life, this skill leads to mistakes. Seeing patterns in randomness can create false beliefs and bad decisions. Understanding the clustering illusion helps in many areas. It teaches gamblers that past results do not affect future outcomes. It reminds investors to look at long-term trends instead of short-term fluctuations. It helps people separate real dangers from random events. The world contains both structure and randomness. Recognizing when patterns are real and when they are illusions improves thinking and decision-making.